Good morning, good noon, good afternoon, good whatever time zone you're in. Welcome to the second day of our Adventist Bioethics Conference, the fifth of such conferences. We're already starting to plan the sixth for next year. And before we finish up this conference, we hope to give you the dates when we plan to meet next year. Just a couple of reminders as we get started today. We have everybody on mute, except for those who are speaking or convening. But we do encourage you to use the chat function to raise any questions or make comments. If you're having any trouble with anything, you can use chat to contact us, and we'll try to address those. We have Brady Clark with us today, who's our technical assistant, and I just want to thank Brady from the whole group here for taking the time. Thank you, Brady, for helping us today with the technology. It was wonderful to hear Dr. Carla Park yesterday give our devotional, and I'm looking forward to what she will share today. Just a word of introduction for Carla, for those of you who don't know her or weren't with us yesterday. Carla is, among many other things, a nurse. I always admire that, since I chose to live with a nurse for the last 55 years here at my house. Carla also holds degrees in religion. She has a PhD from Emory University in religious studies. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, she has a graduate degree in public health and another one in marriage and family counseling. So I once told Carla, I think she's educated within a half inch of her life here. But she brings a great deal of expertise to our kind of conversation. So, Carla, so good to see and hear you again. Thank you for your message yesterday. We look forward to what you're going to share with us now.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Yesterday, we discussed an ethic of wonder and the importance of deep understanding in relation to ethics for the ministry of healing. Today, we're going to discuss the bridge to everywhere, connection and collaboration. So, we feel as if we are more connected than ever. I can meet with you instantly over Zoom, avoiding what years ago would have been a wagon train traveling 2,000 miles over harsh terrain at 2 miles an hour and 20 miles a day for 5 to 6 months. And finding these facts on Google took 5 seconds. The times are certainly different. I can celebrate your presentation, or you can celebrate mine with a little hand clapping emoji in the top right of your screen, or the left, depending on your system. But we are not really connected. We are in contact. Connection is something altogether different. If I have 1,000 followers on Facebook, it does not mean that I am important or have lots of friends. It means I am being followed, and followed by emojis who occasionally like or dislike something I post and share with me what they had for breakfast or invite me to purchase an online goat. It happened. But where is the person behind all of this? Do I sound old, behind the times? Did I lose you at the wagon train story? The reality is, in this decade of social networking, when we have hundreds, thousands of contacts, we discover ourselves to be more alone than ever. The documentary film, The Social Dilemma, explains why. Behind the scenes, there are computer-generated eyes following us, keeping track of our searches, understanding our preferences. Most of us fear someone stealing our personal information, but that's not the real danger. The larger danger is in the computational algorithms that are feeding back to us what we like, what we search for. The effect? We become entrenched in our own ideas, all the while thinking that we are well read, when in fact we are reading and searching what we already like and have already approved. The ads we see, the information that pops up, has been specially selected by the algorithm that knows what we like, because it truly follows us and understands us. We are known and understood by the electronic genie, and avidly consume our own ideas. It will be easy to follow the wrong God home. There are many, even among the generators of this, who feel that we never should have gone down this path. But even they suggest that there is no going back. The genie is out of the bottle. It is more important than ever, imperative, let's say, to know what true connection is, and on the contrary, how to recognize the imposter. Ecclesiastes 4:9-12 helps us understand why connection is important. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, then one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them get up. And if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of three is not easily broken. So why do we connect? Because one is not enough, two are better than one, and three are better still. Going it alone is never preferable. We are stronger, better, warmer together. But how do we connect? John 15:12-13 suggests, love each other as I have loved you. Boom. This is one of the shortest, most baffling texts. We are not asked simply to connect, but to love. And not simply to love, but to love as we are loved by Christ. A love that has descended so low that all other falling is a falling into itself. How do we love like that? It is not just any kind of connection that we establish with each other, but a connection built through love, altruism, care. It is a cord of three strands held together in a very specific way. And it is not enough to know that we should connect, but how that connection takes place. The forest itself is an example of both of these. It is not just an assemblage of individual trees, as we initially thought, which caused us to plant acres of the same kinds of trees, and Christmas tree farms are an example of that. But it's actually more like a society where there is conflict, negotiation, reciprocity. Trees appear to be helping other trees, even those of different species, and possibly even at their own expense. What? Cooperation in nature? Well, how is this possible? What we now understand and no longer view as pop science is that they connect through mycorrhizal networks underneath the Earth's floor, and that when these connections are disturbed, the forest suffers. There is a farm near me run by a young couple that I met last week that is a no-till farm for this very reason. So what is the importance of the connections established in the places that we can't see? It rained last week, thunder and lightning, tree limbs bending and breaking from the push and pull of the wind. And the sound of it, frankly, was haunting, a sort of ominous chorus between thunderclaps. And then suddenly, it was still. On the porch was a spider web that I have been watching over time. Parts of it were damaged as the almost invisible threads attempted to hold water droplets many times its weight. But in the center, at the strongest part of the web, where all the threads came together, the spider sat proudly. "We are still here," it all said. The strength was in the connections at the center of the web. But the idea of connection and collaboration has to go deeper. Recently, I read a book called The Devil in the Grove about 4 young African-American men falsely accused in 1949 of raping a 17-year-old Caucasian woman in a city not far from where I lived. The young men ranged in age from 16 to 20. One of them, the 16-year-old, whose name was Charles Greenlee, had never even met the young woman until the trial. They were imprisoned, beat, 2 were shot and killed by police, 1 made parole, and only the fourth, Charles, lived long enough to have children of his own. 70 years later, the city of Groveland and Lake County apologized, and in 2019, they were all pardoned. But by then, all of them were deceased. I wasn't able to connect with the story until I put the book down after reading it twice and walked in their footsteps. I visited whatever buildings are still standing, stood by their graves, entered into their grief, and visited the monument where the community, having lost its way in its treatment of them, was trying to make restitution. By doing this, I connected with them in a different way. Their story moved me, made me ashamed, helped me realize that I had much to understand, and yet it is not about how I experienced their story, but how they experienced it. And something in me was deeply afraid that if I got close enough to truly connect to it, I would never be the same. That, in fact, turned out to be correct. So what does it mean to connect? It means we are with each other in a different way, loving as Jesus loved, as Christ loves us still. Why is connection imperative to ethics for the ministry of healing? And how does it relate to collaboration? If it is all about survival of the fittest, then we are all alone, competing with each other, and the metaphor is war. But if it is about caring for each other and altruism is the glue that connects us, then the metaphor is the cord of three strands bound together with Christ's love. We forgive when others blame. We are vulnerable when others pretend strength. We are selfless when others are quick to build empires. We connect to the stories of others and consider the possibility that we could be any one of the characters within them. What connects us is the thread that endures. William Stafford talks about this cord, this thread in his poem, The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing, and you have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. When you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding, but you don't ever let go of the thread. So what is the thread? It is the cord of three strands bound together with Christ's love, the unmistakable but perhaps invisible connections below the surface that endure. As a result, when we connect, we form unbreakable bonds, and when we collaborate, we weave immeasurable results. We must never let go of the thread. It is the bridge to everywhere. Let's pray. Lord, connect us, collaborate with and through us. Teach us to love as you love us. Amen.
Thank you, Carla. You've blessed us again. Here now to introduce our morning keynote speaker is Dr. Grace Wee. Grace, good morning. Let me say just a word about Dr. Wee. She is the Associate Director of our Center for Christian Bioethics. She's also an accomplished pediatric intensivist who directs the work of pediatric intensive care at a related system to Loma Linda. And she's one of our professors in our School of Medicine. Good morning, Grace, and please introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much. One of my most memorable ethics consults happened early on as an ethics consultant. The patient was a 67-year-old woman who'd been admitted for a workup of chest pain. She had a known abdominal aortic aneurysm, and during her hospitalization, this aneurysm ruptured. And as these things go, this happened in the middle of the night, and by the time she was rushed down to the OR, she had lost a tremendous amount of blood. She was brought back up to the ICU, already in multi-system organ failure. She survived the night, but as morning stretched into early afternoon, her body failed. The team performed CPR and requested an ethics consult. The rushed resident told me, "There is no use performing CPR again. Can you please help talk with the family?" The physician side of me knew the extent of her physiologic injury. And as I spoke with the family, they shared their shock of the suddenness of the current situation. They had dropped off a healthy mother and grandmother, and now they were being told that she was going to die. They wondered if the hospital team had done something wrong because the aneurysm ruptured before she was taken to the OR. They requested treatments like an en-bloc bowel and liver transplant. It became apparent to me that to this family, CPR did not mean the physiologic intervention, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which to my clinical mind consists of a trio of actions aimed at increasing coronary blood flow to restore an organized cardiac rhythm. CPR to this family was similar to a rite of passage, a way of signaling to the family and themselves that they were doing everything they could think of for their mother and their grandmother. It was an extension of love and an expression of grief, even if they did not yet realize it. So who were we, the clinical team, to say that CPR should not be done? Yesterday, Dr. Macauley, I so appreciated your talk. You spoke with us about the intersection of strongly held faith and personally made choices on aggressive treatment at the end of life. And it really brought home to me that just as religions have symbols and symbolic language, so does the organizational system of medicine. When medicine and religion meet around imminent death, what exactly are we talking about? When is code status really about code status? How do we mediate around strongly held symbols that are shared by both medicine and religion? And how do we promote a ministry of healing when it is needed the most? Dr. Macauley, thank you so much for coming back and for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you for your time. I really look forward to the words that you have to say. And again, thank you for I know, a wonderful talk that is to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for that very gracious introduction. It's nice to be back with you all today. It's going to be a little bit of a different presentation today. Yesterday was a little bit more theological, but I think that Dr. Reed did a wonderful job of queuing this up because there's a lot of ritual and a lot of sacredness in what we're talking about today as well. All right. So we're going to, the title of today's talk is what we talk about when we talk about code status, just a little bit of preparation. I'm a pediatrician, so I'm going to be looking at a little bit of pediatric data, but I'm going to try to correlate that with what we see in the adult world. But actually, I think it's not just about talking about code status, it's about what we talk about when we talk about code status with each other and also with families or patients. And how we express that is really going to have a big impact on what the outcomes are. So how we talk to each other. So I would ask at the beginning, what does DNR mean? It's a term we often use in medicine. And lay people oftentimes know what that means, or at least what the words stand for. So it stands for do not resuscitate. And that seems pretty obvious. At the same time, I don't think we all use this term in the exact same way. So I would ask this of folks, and I'd be curious, like if we were all in person, I would say show of hands, but I'm gonna sort of just ask you to imagine, especially the clinicians who are listening, whether or not certain treatments are indicated. So a patient has a DNR order, would chest compressions be indicated in that patient? And I would say no. Defibrillation, I would say no. Now we flip a little bit. So opioids for either problems breathing or for pain, that would be a yes. Benzodiazepines for anxiety, yes. Anti-salagogues, which are medicines to decrease secretions, especially when someone has a hard time managing their own secretions, I would say yes. And I would venture to say that most people, most clinicians would agree with me on those. Those seem kind of obvious. Now we're going to get a little more tricky. What about endotracheal intubation? So putting a breathing tube down someone's throat. We oftentimes talk about DNI or do not intubate as a separate order. Sometimes people assume they go together with DNR, but I don't think that's always the case. Pressors or medications to raise blood pressure, antibiotics, insulin for high blood sugar, IV fluids. Now, the point of this is to say that the things in the right-hand column are not included under a DNR order, but they oftentimes are associated with it and can cause confusion. So if you just look it up in the encyclopedia, at least the Medline Plus encyclopedia, a DNR order means that it instructs healthcare providers not to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, if breathing stops or if the heart stops beating. So not to do CPR if breathing stops or if the heart stops beating. And it actually has quite a limited application. The President's Commission, a very well-known commission of bioethicists and others from quite a few decades ago now, said that any DNR policy should ensure that the order not to resuscitate has no implications for any other treatment decisions. Patients with DNR orders on their charts may still be appropriate candidates for all other vigorous care. And I oftentimes came back to this when I was doing ethics consults at the University of Vermont. I would occasionally get consult requests from the emergency department saying, and one I always remember, the physician said, this patient has a DNR order, but their family wants antibiotics and they want IV fluids. So can you come and talk to them? And my response was, well, I'm happy to come talk to them, but it sounds like we should give them, the patient, IV fluids and antibiotics, because just because they're DNR doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. So they've done studies, and again, this is the pediatric literature. I think the adult literature is quite similar. When they ask pediatricians what they think DNR means, and they give them choices. One is limitation only with cardiac arrest, and about 2/3 thought that that actually is the right answer. An additional approximately 1/4 felt like it was limitation not related to resuscitation. And perhaps most concerningly, about 6% felt that it referred to comfort measures only. And that, I think, is very, very concerning for how we communicate with each other and how we provide care that is appropriate and consonant with the patient's goals. So the unintended consequences of DNR orders and misperceptions, and this is from the adult literature, it showed, they did a study and they looked at patients with DNR orders. They found that patients with DNR orders had fewer laboratory studies and fewer x-rays and fewer blood transfusions. That all potentially makes sense to me. Because if you are on a comfort-directed plan of care, DNR is part of it. It doesn't describe it all, but it is part of it. If the patient wants to focus on comfort, then undergoing CPR is not a way to achieve that primary goal. At the same time, though, those patients got fewer chart entries. They got fewer physician visits, which I think is concerning. Does that mean we are, in the medical profession, are we stepping back? To put it even more provocatively, are we abandoning patients who have DNR orders? So one of the things that we say often in palliative care is that do not resuscitate does not mean do not treat or do not respond. DNR does not stand for do not respond. It stands for do not resuscitate. And we write articles about this, like the one I quote here. I would actually argue that despite the palliative care community's frequent proclamations that DNR doesn't mean do not treat, it would be more honest to say that it shouldn't mean do not treat, but sometimes it does. Clearly, the studies indicate that it might, and we in the medical profession don't seem to really all understand what it actually means. So what I would like to do is break down some of these things that we looked at the beginning. So I would say that chest compressions and defibrillation are intrinsic to the notion of DNR because that's part of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. There are other things that are irrelevant, whether you have a DNR order or not, that are requisite for high quality end-of-life care that are focused on preventing suffering. And then the rest are contextual. Some might be part of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Some might occur in the context of a patient who has stopped breathing or has no heartbeat. At the same time, they may not. So endotracheal intubation for a patient who is struggling to breathe is not inconsistent with a DNR order. endotracheal intubation for someone who has stopped breathing or who has no heartbeat would be. So I would argue the DNR is defined by context, not by interventions. So if the patient is in full arrest, then we shouldn't do any interventions, no matter how resuscitative they may or may not seem. But if the patient is not in full arrest, then the very fact that they have a DNR order by itself is irrelevant. If it's part of an overall broader plan of care, that's one thing, but simply put, DNR is irrelevant in the context short of full arrest. So why is there such confusion about this? So one reason that there may be some confusion is that linking DNR with things that are not specifically resuscitative is close enough to the true meaning so as not to arouse suspicion. And it's also, the term is used by people who are supposedly learned and hopefully maybe brilliant, like physicians or other healthcare providers. And so people tend to believe us because we tend to say things in an authoritative way, which leads me to consider a movie that I love that perhaps many of you have seen, and we'll see if the video happens to work for us today.
You're that smart.
Let me put it this way. Have you ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes?
Morons.
So some folks may recognize that from The Princess Bride, one of my favorite movies. There's actually another scene in The Princess Bride that is informative for us today, which is when the same person, Zini, who we just saw, keeps using the word inconceivable, and he seems to use it in an unusual way, leading to perhaps one of the more famous quotes from this movie.
Inconceivable. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
And that may also be true for us when we talk about DNR. So people have tried to, if you will, forgive the pun, resuscitate DNR. And they've done it in a couple of ways. One is they've used the term do not attempt resuscitation, which I think is a step in the right direction because it appropriately emphasizes attempt. So one of the problems with DNR is it implies at least that if we chose to begin CPR or do other resuscitative interventions, that we would be successful in resuscitating the patient, which, as we'll see, is not always true and actually not often true. So that's good that it focuses on attempt. The problem is it still relies on this nebulous term resuscitation that we understand in different ways. And it's also still defined in the negative. You know, so many of our abbreviations, especially with regard to end-of-life care, are defined in the negative. Do not intubate, do not resuscitate, do not escalate, do not transfer to the ICU, leading me to wonder if some patients and families are left wondering, if you're not doing all that stuff, is there anything you actually are doing? And I think we're much better off when we focus on what we are doing than what we're not doing. Another term that has been batted about is allow natural death. And that's good in the sense that it's no longer defined in the negative. We're talking about what we're striving for rather than what we're trying to avoid. The bad about it is really not very precise. So to say that we're going to do allow natural death, but then we write orders for benzodiazepines and synthetic opioids makes me, and maybe I'm just persnickety here, wonder what's so natural about things that aren't naturally occurring. So I attempted to remedy this situation. I wrote an editorial in Journal of Palliative Medicine back in 2014, and I formulated a term that I thought was great, and it's called ORACA, and this is how I defined it. A term that meets all the requirements of a good term that is positive and is precise is ORACA. Only respect after cardiac arrest. After cardiac arrest makes it absolutely clear that the term does not apply to any patient who has a pulse, thus preventing inappropriate limitation of treatment. Respect emphasizes that our obligation to a person who will soon be declared dead is not limited to resuscitative interventions and also avoids the negativity of DNR and DNAR. Only acknowledges that providing CPR to a patient struggling to survive can also be an act of respect, not to mention potentially beneficial if that's what the patient wishes. The term thus reassures patients they will be allowed to die in peace if their heart were to stop, while also making it clear to clinicians that as long as a patient's heart is beating, the code status once known as DNR is irrelevant. I thought this article was incisive and eloquent, as anyone in the audience who may be thinking, you know, I never heard of this term ORACA, you'll appreciate the fact that it didn't exactly take off in the way that I was hoping it would. So maybe we could take a look at the spectrum of interventions. So on the one hand, we have full code, which is everything that we could possibly do. CMO is a term some people use for comfort measures only, which is obviously focusing entirely on comfort and not on life prolongation. If we were to look at sort of the spectrum of how this works on this range from full code to comfort measures only, you have DNR, and then the other competing terms like DNAR, A&D, and ORACA. You also have do not intubate, because there could be patients who say, if I'm having a hard time breathing, give me some help. So they would want to be intubated, but if they have no respiratory effort and no pulse, they would want to be allowed to be kept comfortable and allowed to die. So that would be this group. Then somebody might say, well, I don't want to be intubated anyway, even if it's only for respiratory failure. And then do not escalate treatment is a term that is sort of a broader term. Certainly intubating or resuscitating would be an escalation of treatment, but so would a lot of other things like pressors or other things that are not specifically resuscitated. So this has got increasing attention in the medical literature. At the same time, I think it has some challenges. So I would ask again, just like we did at the very beginning, do certain interventions qualify if a patient has a do not escalate treatment order? CPR, I would say, would not. Intubation would not. Starting pressors or medications to raise blood pressure would not. But adding a second pressor when there's already one, increasing a ventilator setting that's positive ended expiratory pressure, dialing up the oxygen. So say somebody has an acute desaturation, just taking them dial and giving them, instead of 30% oxygen, giving them 70% oxygen for a few minutes in case they maybe have a mucus plug or some such thing. So in the end, those are unclear. And in one of the more sage evaluations of do not escalate treatment orders, Curtis and Rubenfeld write that such an approach should be a reluctant negotiated settlement rather than a frequently used strategy. And I would agree with that, mostly because I think that a do not escalate treatment order sounds good, but really what it does is it shifts a lot of the responsibility to the physician and leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So all of these terms, DNR, DNAR, all these initials have problems, because what we're trying to do, I would argue, is encapsulate a treatment plan for a human being with a few letters. And I think we're doomed to fail when we do that. So those are the terms that we use when we talk to each other. Well, when we talk to patients or families? So when we talk to patients or families, I think we do three things, and I think they're all wrong. One is we give them a lot of data, then we talk about what we're not going to do, and then we ask them to make impossible decisions. Let's take them one by one. So we give them data, like about the probability of CPR working. So what is the probability of CPR working? If somebody says, well, if you do CPR, what are my chances? Well, that depends. Depends on the patient's underlying condition. Depends on what rhythm. Is it a shockable rhythm or not? Depends on the treatment available and how quickly it is available. It's one of the big reasons why in-hospital CPR is more effective than out of hospital. And it depends on what working means. So technically speaking, the purpose of CPR, as Dr. Wee mentioned earlier, is to restore spontaneous circulation. At the same time, for most people, that's not their goal. The goal of CPR for most people is not to get their heart going, even if temporarily for just a few minutes. The goal is to get them back to something, back to home, back to seeing their family, back to recognizing the people close to them, back to not requiring more CPR, whatever that might be. So the outcomes of pediatric CPR, which is the world that I live, are actually much better than they are in the adult world. And the outcomes for an ROSC is return of spontaneous circulation. So we can actually do a pretty good job in the pediatric world with that. For in-hospital CPR, it goes way down when you start getting out of the hospital. And it's much higher in the ICU, in part because the team is ready to go and they're very aware of the need and can do it extremely well. In the adult literature, the data that I'm familiar with is for a patient in the hospital who is sick enough to undergo CPR, they have roughly a 25 to 30% chance of survival to discharge. And then if they are survive to discharge, they have about a 2/3 chance of getting roughly back to where they were before. So if you do the numbers, that means that if you're sick enough to be in the hospital and you undergo CPR, you have about a 1 in 6 chance of going home and being able to be back to roughly your level of functioning before. Now, there's lots of ways of parsing that data, and sometimes the data goes up or sometimes it goes down year to year, in part because I think we're doing a better job of selecting or helping people decide whether to undergo CPR. So sometimes the better outcomes are the fact that we're refraining from engaging in CPR with certain patients if we think the probability is so poor that they'll actually have a good outcome, and we can help them with that conversation, as we'll see in a few minutes. So we know that stuff, the data I just said to you, because we went to school for a long time. But I would ask, how do patients and families learn about CPR? And I think they learn about it on television. So Baywatch was a classic, really awful show from a while back. And they have depictions of CPR on television shows like Baywatch that lead to a much, much different understanding than we physicians have. So this next slide is going to show what CPR looks like on TV.
How long was she down? A couple minutes at least.
No pulse. Begin CPR.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Where's the damn defib?
Coming in. 3, 4, 5. 1. Help me out. 2, 3.
Come on, Neely, come on!
5. All right, clear. Shocking. Clear. Shocking. Still no pulse. All right, second shock. Everyone clear. Shocking twice. Shocking.
Come on, Neely, come on! Still no pulse.
All right, third shock. Everyone clear. Shocking. Still no pulse. All right, I'm gonna give her one more at 360. Clear. Shocking. Clear.
I got a pulse, guys. I got a pulse. All right. All right.
So the clinicians in the room and maybe others will recognize this. There's no relationship whatsoever to what CPR really looks like. And it's not surprising that when we have conversations about CPR with families, that oftentimes they will say yes to things that we would not think they would say yes to, because that's their understanding. And in case an anecdote isn't enough, there was an article that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine now about 25 years ago. It's been duplicated since. And forgive me if I sound a little jealous, but the three authors spent some time watching an entire season of 3 medical dramas on television, including ER, the television show back in the 90s. And they tracked CPR outcomes and they got it published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which makes me feel kind of regretful because I was watching all those shows. I just didn't think to write an article about it. And what they found was that on TV or on the show ER, the vast majority of people who undergo CPR are non-elderly, which is not the case in reality. Most have a secondary cardiac arrest, meaning their hearts are pretty good, but they have something else, whether it's low oxygen or a metabolic abnormality that causes their hearts to stop. Whereas in reality, most people who undergo CPR have some intrinsic heart disease. So even if you get the heart going again, it's still not in the greatest shape. And perhaps most importantly, on TV, about 2/3 of people survive to discharge, and they survive and seem refreshed and rejuvenated somehow. Whereas in reality, only a small minority do. So sometimes what happens is we give people data or we try to educate them, but they have a much different understanding of CPR than we do. Then we also talk a lot about what we're not going to do. So especially in the handoff culture where we have teams taking over for other teams, it's not uncommon, I'm not saying it's inappropriate in intention, for teams to say, so just so we're clear, we're not going to do CPR if your child or loved one's heart stops or your heart stops. We're not going to put you or your loved one on a breathing machine. And if there's an infection, we're not going to use antibiotics. As I said before, it makes you wonder if families get the impression that there's really not anything we are doing. So the end result is, what are we doing? And it tilts the equation towards full code, otherwise known as why not give it a try? Like, what do I have to lose? If you're telling me I'm going to die if I don't get CPR, then why not at least give it a shot? So I often think about that, especially when we give data, even if I say there's a 1 in a million chance something is going to work. When I say that to a family, I'm probably thinking, well, they're going to say no. Like, why would somebody do something that if they're only a 1 in a million chance? But I don't think that's a good, thoughtful understanding of human nature. So Chaucer once said that many a truth is said in jest. I'm going to show you another movie clip. I want to be really clear, really, really clear. I'm not comparing patients to the characters in this movie, but I do think that there's a lot of wisdom and humor. So this is a movie called Dumb and Dumber, and this is when Jim Carrey's character is hoping to have a relationship with this beautiful woman.
I want to ask you a question straight out, flat out, and I want you to give me the honest answer. What do you think the chances are of a guy like you and a girl like me ending up together?
Well, Lloyd, that's difficult to say, and we really don't...
Hit me with it. Just give it to me straight. I came a long way just to see you married. Just, least you can do is level with me. What are my chances?
Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1 million.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
So I think a funny scene, but also a lot of wisdom there. So if I say to a family or a patient, there's a 1 in a million chance of this saving your life, those odds aren't good. But if the odds of them surviving without that procedure are 0 in a million, then it's actually very logical to say yes, if we're only looking at the chance of success, as opposed to what may be lost along the way. And I would argue that there is something to lose with being quote unquote full code. And that might be comfort at the end of life. That might be dying on one's own terms. That might be being at home, surrounded by people who love you, as opposed to having people who don't know you and maybe strangers do things to you at the end that are potentially burdensome and invasive. And the last thing we do when we talk to families is we ask them to make impossible decisions. So I would argue that this is how it usually works, at least in my experience. We review the clinical context. We make sure everybody understands the medical situation. We describe the treatment options. So you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, including code status. And then we ask parents, in my world as a pediatrician, or as patients, or as families to decide. And then we respect their decision. Good. We're honoring autonomy, we think. We're giving them, empowering them with making decisions. We're not acting paternalistically. I don't think that works actually very well. That adds a lot of burden to families, and I think it asks them to make impossible decisions. So I think in terms of how it could work is I think, and this is one thing when we have learners rotate with our team, I say, I don't want you to ask people what their code status is. I want you to recommend a code status to them. To say that I would recommend that you be full code or DNR, DNI, whatever terms we are going to use. And that may seem very paternalistic, but I said before that, we have to identify the patient or family's goals. And so the recommendation is not based on what we think is right or our own values, based on what a family or patient are hoping for. So how can we figure out what the patient's code status should be without mentioning any procedures? So that identifying patient or family's goals, it's important to say here is that is a conversation in the vernacular. That is not a technical, procedural oriented conversation. And so I challenge our learners and our team to have this conversation in common language rather than resorting to any kind of procedures. So how do we do that? This is called the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. It comes out of the Ariadne Labs, which is a tool Gawande's operation in Boston in collaboration with Harvard. And basically it's a way, an approach to looking at serious illness conversations. And some of it makes good sense. You set up the context, you get a sense of what the patient or family's understanding is, et cetera, et cetera. The part that I want to really focus on is exploring key topics. And there are 6. One is goals. Another word for that is hopes, which we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes in more detail. But those are the things you want to have happen. Fears or worries are the things you don't want to have happen. And I think sometimes we don't delve into goals or hopes, but I think more frequently we don't delve into fears and worries, because that's scary, understandably. But if we don't know what a patient's greatest fear or worry is, then we're not going to know how to help them avoid that. So as an example for me personally. So I have lots of hopes and goals in life, and I have also fears and worries. And probably my greatest fear when I think of my life, and especially my health, is not dying younger than I could have, although that would be something I would obviously seek to avoid. My greatest fear is that I would develop dementia and I would become a different person in terms of personality. I'm 54 years old. I think I've spent the last 54 or so years establishing myself as someone who I like to think is kind and generous. I think if you ask my family, especially my kids, they would view me that way. And my greatest fear is that I would develop dementia and I would change. Some people do change, some for the better, some for the worse. And I've known people who, when they became demented, they became kind of mean, and it wasn't really them anymore. I don't ever want my kids and my grandkids one day to think about me that way. So that's my fear. And I think my doctors and my medical team need to know that. So goals and fears are kind of the flip side of each. Two other things here is about critical abilities. What abilities make life worth living for you or for the patient? And the flip side of that is how much you're willing to go through to get there. So this is what's important to me. These are my critical abilities. How much are you willing to endure in order to maintain those? And the last two things are what gives you strength and how much do you want your family to be involved and how much do they know? Those are 6 things. And I would argue that if we can identify those 6 things, then we can generate a plan. We can make a recommendation for a plan. Now, I want to be really transparent about this. This is not easy. It's not quick. It's not the kind of thing that it's a lot quicker to say, hey, if your heart stops, do you want us to try to get it going again for you? That is very rapid. It doesn't take more than a minute. This takes a long time, takes skill, takes probing, takes managing emotion. But I think it's what we're called to do. So talking a little bit more about hopes. When I say to a family, what do you hope for? Oftentimes they're like, I don't really understand that question. I'm not used to doctors asking that question. They're used to doctors asking things like, are you pooping regularly? Or what hurts? So we sort of got to say, no, I really am asking this question, like, what do you hope for? And this is from a wonderful article in the New England Journal from about 10 years ago, At the Breadth of Hopes. And the author, Chris Huebner, said, some clinicians fear that discussing hope with patients or the families of patients who are facing grave or terminal illness will only engender false hope and thereby impair decision-making and care, especially if they say they hope for something that they're not going to probably get. And true enough, when I ask what people are hoping for, I often learn about hopes of miracles and cures of waking up from bad dreams. These hopes are often shared first, quickly and nervously. I try to probe further, gently asking, do you mind telling me what else you might be hoping for? The subsequent answers tend to be qualitatively different from the initial hopes. They are more oriented to pain or suffering and the hope of relief, to the longing for home and the hope of homecoming, or to surviving not in a physical but in a spiritual sense, and the hope of finding meaning and connection. And that's what we do in palliative care often is we say, what do you hope for? And then when someone finishes, we say, thank you. What else do you hope for? And we keep going until they run out. And what we found is that there's a lot. So as an example, this is an article from the Journal of Clinical Oncology that took that approach with the parents of kids with cancer. And what they found was that if you do that parents could identify a median number of 7 distinct hopes. Not just, the first one's kind of obvious, cure, long life, but there's a lot more to it than that. And when you look at it, some of these are completely antithetical to each other. So cure, that's obviously the most common, that's a big one. Quality of life is right up there too, but there's also hope for future research so other kids will get better care. There will be hope for minimal suffering. So it is possible as a parent to hope that your child survives and also hope that when they die, but you don't hope what happens, that they'll die comfortably and maybe in your arms. So when we look at the spectrum of dialogue, I think that there's we can stretch it a lot more than what we do right now. Right now, it's here are your choices. What do you think? And so we go basically on an approach of informed refusal. So informed refusal means I'm going to keep doing everything until you tell me not to, and you can choose not to in these areas if you wish. Some people have put forth this notion of informed assent, which basically means that I would say, based on what you told me about your goals, fears, critical abilities, strengths, trade-offs, etc., this is what I would recommend as a treatment plan, and you're free to take my recommendation. Now, that may seem like something of a semantic distinction, but it does, especially when we're talking about saying no to some treatment or not pursuing some aggressive treatment. I think it can be helpful to remove some of the burden from a family or a patient. And then taking it even further is what some people have called informed non-dissent, where we state to the family or to the patient or to the parents, based on what you told me, it doesn't seem like this is an appropriate part of the treatment plan. So we're not going to do that unless you disagree or unless you object. And then they don't have to do anything. They don't even have to say, yes, I agree with the treatment plan, or I defer to your recommendation. And when I think about this, I think of one example that I'll never forget. And this was a family I got to know very well. Parents were colleagues of mine, both medical professionals. And they had a child who was about 2 years old with an undiagnosed neurologic condition that seemed to be degenerative. And we had lots and lots of conversations over many months about what they wanted for their son. And he took a turn for the worse one day, came into the hospital, was in respiratory distress, was on the pediatric floor, and was getting to the point where if he got much worse, he would have to go to the ICU. And I said to them, using the informed assent approach, I don't think that this is what you want for your child. We've had all these conversations. Unless something has changed, I would recommend that we not transfer to the ICU and we not escalate treatment, including CPR, intubation, etc. And you're free to take my recommendation or something to that effect. And they couldn't answer. These incredibly thoughtful, intelligent, planning ahead people were emotionally paralyzed because they loved their son so much. And we all knew what was going to happen, that if there wasn't a clear order in the chart saying don't, it was going to keep going, and we were going to escalate. That's the way the medical system works. And I was confident enough at the time that that's not what they wanted, that I took it one step further, and I said, in this notion of informed non-dissent, which is a paradigm that I actually wasn't even familiar with at the time. And I said, I don't think this is what you want. So in about 5 minutes, I'm going to step out and I'm going to write a do not transfer, do not intubate, do not resuscitate order for your child. And if you don't want me to, you can tell me. And we sat there for a few more minutes and we had some silence, but we talked about stuff that wasn't super important. And then I said, I'm going to get up and do that thing. They didn't object, and I did. And the patient died that afternoon, very comfortably. Lest that seemed just like it's never a happy ending, really, when a child dies. But lest that seemed like a good approach or something to be emulated, I have to confess that the amount of burden that I personally carried, the amount of self-doubt that I carried was extreme on that case. And when we gathered again a few weeks later, when they asked me to be there, when we got the autopsy results, because they were worried about what that meant for their other child and what any future children, I realized that if the autopsy revealed something that we could have done something about and we didn't, that it wasn't just me feeling bad for the parents that they made a decision they might regret, but I was part of that. And I carried that weight. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And I think that told me a little bit about burdens. So the way we normally do things is we give a lot of information, and then the patient or the parent or the family carries the weight of the world on their shoulders. Informed assent means that we listen to the patient and then we sort of reflect back to them what we're hearing and say, this is a recommendation based on that plan. And then informed non-dissent in a way kind of shifts the weight of the world a little bit, or at least it's shared, and there's an old saying, a burden shared is a burden halved. So I'm grateful for that, but I'm not sure if that's something that we would aspire to do day in and day out. So some take-home points, and then hopefully a couple minutes for conversation. DNR shouldn't mean many things to many people, but it does. A few letters can't sum up goals of care. We shouldn't dwell on the negative. We should focus on goals and call into question the nothing to lose argument. And instead of asking parents or patients or families what they think the code status should be at the start of a conversation, I think we should recommend the code status at the end of it. And the last thing I'd say is I just want to talk about the title of this talk. So what we talk about when we talk about code status may conjure references that are somewhat literary, which are intentional. So Raymond Carver, who's a wonderful author, wrote a collection of stories, and the title story is What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And I think there's a parallel here. So love and code status. So in this story, two couples are trying to talk about love, but instead they end up talking about all kinds of other stuff. Lots of different things that really maybe don't have much to say about love until the very end of this story. And at the very end of the story, they end up talking about an elderly couple in a car crash that one of the characters has seen. And this is what he says. I dropped in to see each of them every day, sometimes twice a day if I was up doing other calls anyway as a physician. Casts and bandages head to foot, both of them. You know, you've seen it in the movies. That's just the way they look, just like in the movies. Little eye holes and nose holes and mouth holes. And she had to have her legs slung up on top of it. Well, the husband was very depressed for the longest while. Even after he found out that his wife was going to pull through, he was still very depressed. Not about the accident, though. I mean, the accident was one thing, but it wasn't everything. I'd get up to his mouth hole, you know, and he'd say, no, it wasn't the accident exactly, but it was because he couldn't see her through his eye holes. He said that that was what was making him feel so bad. Can you imagine? I'm telling you, the man's heart was breaking because he couldn't turn his gosh darn, my word, head and see his gosh darn wife. And the significance of this story to me is that what we're talking about when we talk about code status is actually something very different than code status. We're talking about life. We're talking about hopes. And we struggle to talk about it. And sometimes we only get around to that at the very end. And even when we got around to it, we don't know what to do with it. So this is how the story, Carver's story ends. Do you see what I'm saying? He said, maybe we were a little drunk then. I know it was hard keeping things in focus. The light was draining out of the room, going back through the window where it had come from. Yet nobody made a move to get up from the table to turn on the overhead light. And that's how the story ends. So what I'm asking us to do is to talk about things that are hard to talk about and sometimes leave us speechless, but are the most important things that we talk about, especially for patients. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully we have a couple of minutes for conversation or questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Macauley. Wow, you know, when you present it in that way, that's a lot of baggage for these little letters. You know, we have just a little bit of time for conversation. I do have a question, and then the remaining time, I see that we have a couple hands up too. One question is, in the stories that you told, you know, there was a meaningful exploration of values. What happens when a family's values, after a very meaningful exploration, what if the family's values clash with your own personally held values? And that determines different treatment choices.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the question is how, what level of sort of sacredness or value we put on our own values. Like people make different decisions than I do all the time. Like to take a very glib example, I think it's morally wrong to root for the New York Yankees, but I still permit other people to do that, even though the Red Sox are clearly the superior team. Now, it's obviously a glib example, but people have the right to make decisions that are contrary to what I would do or what I think I would do. The question then is, what if we're getting into an area that we feel to be sort of prescripted in some way? Like if someone is asking for something that I feel to be so morally wrong that, you know, in pediatrics, that it contravenes the best interest standard, if you will, for the patient. Then I think what I would say is we need to get some external input. Like how much of this is me Like, am I on solid ground? Is this just a polite difference of opinion, or is this really rising to the level where I cannot accept their view? Because the danger of saying that I'm not willing to do something that conflicts with my own values is it comes very dangerously close to me saying, I'll do what the patient or the family wants as long as I happen to agree with it. In which case, me inquiring about their values is sort of an empty question, because I already know where we're going to end up. It's just a question of whether we're going to get there willingly or unwillingly. So I think that there is going to be a valuable way for us to reach out to our colleagues, perhaps an ethics committee, just to have a bit of a gut check to make sure that we're not asserting our values inappropriately.
Thank you for that. I see a hand. Sergio, if you want to unmute yourself, we just have a couple of minutes left. So with that caveat, oh, there you go. Thank you.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Macauley. I really appreciate your presentation. One of the things that I was considering as you spoke is the system developed by Respecting Choices in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is a very effective system that focuses on educating the community way before they come to the hospital and have to make those decisions. If you're familiar with that system, what would you say about it? Would you endorse that? Is that something that we should be pursuing? Just like Kettering Health Network, for example, is pursuing this in Ohio. I used to work for them. That's why I know.
No, I appreciate the question very much. I'm a big fan of that system. I think one of the advantages of it is that I sometimes refer to it as staged advanced care planning. So it's not like you're about to be admitted to the hospital and, oh my gosh, you have to talk about your mortality. And they also deal with it at points in life where people can manage the questions. So, if you take a otherwise healthy 30-year-old, asking them if they want to get CPRs, like, first of all, it's sort of unimaginable. It's also largely inapplicable. Like, the chances of that patient having an arrest is incredibly low. And so oftentimes what happens is in situations like that, the staged advanced care planning says, if you can't make decisions for yourself, who do you want to make decisions for you, which is much more applicable and also a much easier question to answer because you can imagine it. And then maybe you talk about a neural trauma, because an otherwise healthy 30-year-old, the thing that they're probably the biggest risk for where they can't make their own decisions is some kind of head injury. And then you ramp up the sort of intensity of the conversations over time. So I think I'm a big fan of the process. I think that the challenge is that we continue to live in a death-denying culture, and how to invite people into that conversation. It's not quite as scary as if your heart stops, what do you do? But it's still acknowledging the fact that we're not immortal and we're not impregnable. And what are we going to be able to do in terms of inviting people in tough conversations?
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would love for this conversation to continue. I'm seeing requests for slides, and yes, we will make that available. Dr. Winslow, can you take us? Are we going to a break now?
Yes, but first of all, my own profound thanks to Dr. Macauley. I could imagine that we'll save each other's telephone numbers and we'll be back in touch for another conference, because I can see from the response of the people who've watched that we will hope to hear from you again. Thank you. Thank you so much for today. We will take a break now. We'll start again in about 12 minutes or at 15 minutes after the hour, where we'll be hearing from Dr. Peter Landless. Many of you know Dr. Landless, and we'll be introducing him at 15 minutes after the hour. So let's take a break right now, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. To all of you, or if you're just joining us, welcome to the 5th Adventist Bioethics Conference, coming to you this year via Zoom. Next year, we hope to be in Orlando, Florida, and we'll give more information about that before this series of meetings ends. It's a wonderful privilege for me to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Peter Landless is the director of the Worldwide Adventist Church's Health Ministries Department. I was surprised, pleasantly surprised to learn one time that the Adventist Church has organized health ministries or health services in something like 200 of the world's countries. That's an amazing fact of life. One of the things for a relatively small denomination to be that engaged in health ministry. And that grows out of a commitment that Adventists have to what we call whole person care. So Dr. Landless is an accomplished physician. He's a specialist in cardiology. And if you look in the program and see all those letters behind his name, that means he's the fellow of some very important societies. He is also a former member of President Nelson Mandela's cardiac team. Peter Landless is from South Africa, and he holds the Distinguished South Africa Southern Cross Medal, which is given to people who have provided distinguished service in that country. So, Dr. Landless, what a great honor to have you with us here today and to talk about the importance of ethics in the worldwide health ministries of the Adventist Church. I would guess that that will generate some questions, and I look forward to what you're going to tell us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winslow. What a privilege it is to be with you and this wonderful group today. I regard it a very special honor and privilege. And as I contemplated about what we should discuss, I came to many different conclusions over the weeks prior to this meeting. You know, I'm going to share with you some slides, and thereafter I'm going to encourage you to take off your seatbelts, relax, and we're going to talk just from the heart. Because there's very little that I can teach, if anything, about bioethics. What I would like to share with you is that I am learning and continue to learn that this is a road that we need to walk together. Just recently, I had the wonderful privilege of meeting a new friend, a new colleague, new to me. He's been around a little while, a very successful vaccine scientist. And I'd invited him to speak to our world health leaders on the issues related to the COVID-19 vaccine. And because he's actually in that research setting, and because he serves along with the state levels of vaccine research and preparation and advisors to the CDC, what better person could we have had? And I spent some time with him, as some of you may have had that opportunity. How do you explain to people what your church or your faith is? There are a number of people who are very familiar with the Seventh-day Adventist Church listening right now, and there are some who may not be as familiar. And I didn't take for granted that he knew much about Seventh-day Adventists. And being the very careful scientist that he is, I thought I'd best give him all the details so that when he presents his talk and he gets questions about, are we going to be injected with thus and so? And why so quickly? And what are the preservatives? And why would there be anything that would defile the body be taken in? And as I was explaining things to him and I was being gently cautious, he smiled patiently and he said to me, you don't have to go any further. He said, firstly, I want to tell you that I am a believer in Jesus. That's wonderful. And he said, I know Adventists better than you may think I do. Tell me more. He said, well, actually, the church that my small community worships in is a Seventh-day Adventist church, but we use it on a Sunday. Well, that was saving me a fair amount of descriptive conversation. All I asked him is, said, have they been good to you? And he burst into a broad smile and said, absolutely. If he hadn't, I wondered what I'd have been constrained to do. But it almost becomes like when we describe a faith system, a faith organization, like those men who were blindfolded and had to identify or describe an elephant. One got hold of the tail and said it's like a rope. One got hold of the trunk and said it's like a huge hose. One wound his arms around the leg. He said it's a tree. Someone touched the tusk and said this has got to be stony. So you see, dear friends, it depends how we look at it as to who we as faith-based people really are. And as I thought more and more about our time together, I decided to turf aside the initial very wordy, almost defensive PowerPoint that I had constructed, and thought that I would share with you a few thoughts and a few ideas, and basically in the beginning, just a few descriptors. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is a church which is committed to the proclamation of the gospel. We also have, as we often say within our DNA, health ministry. And we actually, in the last 10, 12 years, have adopted an approach to health ministry looking at comprehensive health ministry, which is the holistic approach, body, mind, spirit, social, relational. That has been there since our founding. But the term comprehensive health ministry emphasizes this important emphasis on the holistic well-being. What does it mean? We spent a few days 10, 11 years ago thinking, how could we best describe what we should be doing in extending the healing ministry of Jesus? And this is a definition that came directly out of the book, just a little paraphrased, called Ministry of Healing, page 143. Meeting people's needs in a practical way by demonstrating God's love and compassion. I believe that's where we should be. That's what we should be doing. Demonstrating God's love and compassion. Well, there are some statistics which may or may not be impressive, but we have a large organization. We are blessed to be the largest Protestant healthcare faith-based organization in the world. We also have the largest faith-based Protestant educational system in the world. And there's much work being done. Many millions of charity dollars being generated. Orphanages, hospitals, airplanes, clinics and dispensaries, many nursing homes. And so there are all these entities. And yet, is it enough? In the background of all of that, including 7 medical schools, 78 nursing schools, surely we have need for guidelines, statements regarding health. And we have many of those. I counted them up again just before preparing for this presentation. I listed 37 that are on our Health Ministries website, and you can go and see them all. But it talks about abortion, affirmation of family, AIDS, birth control, care of the dying, chemical use, abuse and dependency, gambling, genetic interventions, global poverty and its relationship to health, homelessness and poverty, homosexuality, human gene therapy, human relations, and so it goes on, a slew. Immunization, very topical right now. Nurture and retention and protection of children. One humanity. This is the most recent statement that was voted, a human relations statement addressing racism, casteism, tribalism, ethnocentrism. And I was so grateful to see this particular one as well being voted and to be part of some of the wording that has been employed in that. Because you see that as a South African, having grown up and understood only in my later teen years exactly what apartheid was all about, and questioning in my thinking, where was my church during this whole episode? Sexual behavior, smoking and tobacco, abuse and family violence, temperance and financial ethics, transgender. And I listened very carefully yesterday as I heard and have been blessed to learn again to take note of the importance of being careful of the ism word to separate a them and an us. Sexual abuse, assisted human reproduction, violence against women and girls, ethical considerations in cloning, female genital mutilation. All of these issues which people like you and I care about, work with, and wish was maybe a lot different, yet it's not. Having said all of that, we're going to stop sharing now. How often is it that I have the privilege and opportunity to address a group like this? I know and I appreciate, and again want to thank Jerry for his kindness. And every bioethics committee he has, or conference, he has extended an invitation, and I have been so blessed. Thank you, Jerry. You've been a friend for many years. You've been a mentor. You've been a role model. And when I'm among the friends who are interested in ethics, I find not only my friends, I find some of my pastors, I find Carla, I find colleagues, I find Ted, Randy, sometimes Peter Barth, who refers to himself as Peter the Younger, is there to cast the odd aspersion. But what a blessing as we walk this road together. And how often do we really pause to see how is it that we could do more together? And I have to acknowledge right up front that this is very much a two-way street. So often the question is asked is, where is the church? Where is the church when we're having these conversations? Well, the church, I have a very good friend who says, well, it depends. What time is it when you ask that question? Because sometimes the church is in a worship place, provided it's not COVID time. During the week, the church is in the workplace. And so where the church is where the people are, where the 22 million people with the various hospitals and institutions and healthcare clinics are. That's where the church is. But where is the church when it comes into the discussion with health systems, with education systems, who are putting into place and crafting ethics statements, plans, thoughts, ideas? I have another disclaimer that I just wish to add, and I need to mention this right up front. Jerry gave a very generous introduction, probably far too much. But he's told you a little bit of who I am. Who I am. Well, where I'm from is a is a no-brainer because my speech betrays me. But why am I here? Why am I here, not only in the conference here in the United States, serving in the church, serving at the headquarters? Well, basically, I'm here because I love this church. And I know that there are many who love their church, whichever one that may be. I was born into this church. And I continue to wish to serve this church. And I stay with it because I believe in it. And I also believe that the best is yet to come. But as I pause and think about opportunities, think about situations that we discuss, that we disagree on, some we agree on, some we find so challenging. And I've been so blessed by the presentations I've heard in the last 2 days. The depth of thought, of preparation, of analysis, of contemplation has been just amazing and has been good for me. But having said that, I really wish we would talk more with each other. I really wish that we would have meetings like this where we would have individuals, maybe not even as large as this, but have people meeting, talking about the cutting edge issues in bioethics which affect our health systems. And when I use the word our, I say that with gracious pride, gratitude to be involved with such amazing institutions, people, and minds. What do we need to do as we move forward in this kind of setting? I said I believe the best is yet to come. I think there's got to be a lot more you and I, we and them in this conversation. I realize we need to be careful, and Dr. Hart pointed out yesterday the fine line between accepting and promoting, and we need to be thoughtful about how we approach issues. But it doesn't mean that by the church sometimes not talking about it, that we are solving any problems. What I've noticed very much is that as we in ecclesiastical settings, sometimes the meetings, people talk about these people. I find that so offensive and sad, because I don't like being called to these people. I like to be one of us. I like to be a people, not these people. We need to learn, and I'm speaking particularly from the church's point of view. When I've heard the words, people saying, well, so-and-so forgave the shooter of her son. Within the day, they were saying, we forgive you for what you've done. And I wrestle with the concept, which is so often mouthed in church circles, which says, we need to learn to love the sinner and hate the sin. Something which we haven't really mastered that well. I remember yesterday it was brought up again in the beginning of our meeting, Micah 6 verse 8. What does the Lord require of us, O mortal? But to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. That includes me. That includes you. It includes us as we create these guidelines, statements, ethics approaches. And I deeply value the work that is being done by ARPA. I deeply appreciate the work that is done by Adventist Bioethics Consortium. And I admire and am thankful for the perseverance and the wisdom that goes into what is being done. But what worries me, and in fact keeps me awake, is sometimes I find the conversations become a little stilted. The conversations sometimes are one-sided, from either side it could be. And sometimes when I hear approaches, both from within health care organizations and within the church, conversations and tones of approach, which worries me about the day or the time, when hospitals and institutions will say, we don't want to be part of that. Or worse still, where the church might say, purely because of lack of communication and understanding, it's time to dispense with our hospitals. I'm sharing with you my own convictions and thoughts. This is not coming from a general conference committee. It comes to you from a heart that is filled with desire to see a better way forward. So what do we need? I would put it to you that we need to speak more. We sometimes need to even disagree more. I think one of the reasons I love Jerry so much is because he and I have disagreed. I'll never forget, he called me, and he may have forgotten this, but I'm going to remind him. It was, and I remember which year it was. I was on a certain specific task, and I was in Switzerland. I know a place that Jerry loves well. And call came in, and I always take his call. I said to him, Jerry, I said, I'm just in the midst of something right here. And Jerry had some words to tell me about an important issue of end-of-life care and the lack of a consultation which had occurred. I had just come into my position as director at the time. And I said to him, Jerry, I'm overseas. Could we talk a little later? Jerry said, I need to talk to you. So we talked. And we subsequently had another very deep conversation about it. But I appreciated that. I appreciated it. It showed me and it taught me, and it was an initial step for me in my leadership role of how best to move forward and do things well, to mutually consult and share. The engagements have always been respectful. And that's what we need to do as well, from both sides. We need to learn to disagree respectfully. But ongoing engagement and communication is key. I know and have experienced that the desire of so many who work within this setting, and I want to appreciate and affirm you for that, has been to articulate Adventist Christian perspectives. And Dr. Hart mentioned that yesterday when he pointed out that that is one of the huge challenges we need to meet. But that needs to always come within the framework that we need each other. We're not a them and us. We're a fellowship of faith. And I think of the prayer that Jesus prayed in John chapter 17 when he said, I pray that they may be one as thou, Father, and I are one. I worry that that's a desire and a goal which we're a way away from achieving. Could it be that we could have conversations with Biblical Research Institute Adventist Bioethics Consortium, ARPA, present papers, share and dialogue. Now, I know this kind of conference is also the venue for that, but I would think that we could, and I know that Jerry is open to this, but I'm sharing it to the broader group. If we could think of how it could be that we could spend more time sharing with each other. Right now, COVID has intervened in an unbelievable way. An unprecedented time, which none of us anticipated, and is taking its toll on all of us. But and it seems as though here in the United States, thankfully, there seems to be a very important light at the end of the tunnel. As that occurs, it'll open up the time for more discussion. And I'm not like those who feel that Zoom is the answer to all our needs. I love meeting in person. I love eye contact. I love reading body language, which I find very much more difficult to do. Even when people I know are looking at the email while we're talking. But that doesn't matter. But when you're together, when you can agree, when you can leave a venue knowing, you know what, that was great. It was iron sharpening iron. And I've heard it spoken about here as well, but it's an issue which we would do well to consider together. And I really appreciate the work that Carlisle and the team are doing. Carlisle Walton, it's been a pleasure and joy to work with you on the vaccines task force for the North American division. We're in a situation where we need to talk about how we ethically, and this afternoon's opening talk, or this morning for some, talking about assent and dissent and agreement, and move it into the realm of vaccines hesitancy. How do we ethically go forward on this? Another case in point, which I think is important, the vaccines are important. Many things are so important. But I'd like to lift out an illustration to show the importance of openly speaking with each other. In 1992, the Christian View of Human Life produced an excellent document. Dr. Winslow was there, and actually I think was probably one of the most leading and reasoned lights in that. I was still in grade school at the time, but he was in that committee and produced an excellent statement on principles of caring in abortion. Prior to that time, the Seventh-day Adventist Church did not have an excellent record related to abortion. It's the Anglo-Saxon statement of saying we had a lot of work to do. And as time went on, after 1992, we fast forward to 2017. And in the minds of many who were following the situation were the statistics related to the 1970s, places outside of the United States, and even inside the United States, right within the backyard of the General Conference, as it were. And when we came to the General Conference Annual Council in 2019 and presented a document on, or a statement related to abortion, I had the privilege of giving an answer to the question, is this statement a nuclear weapon against the health systems? It's recorded, you can read it on, see it on YouTube, and I had the blessing of having had good communication with each of our health systems in this country and a number of them overseas, and was able to share actual documented figures, which proved beyond doubt that our hospitals and institutions are not slaughter fields of abortion. There were some who are so fixed in their lives and understanding of the past prior to 1992 that a handful said we don't believe it. But I know it's true. I'm grateful that conversations have taken place, and I would urge that in the process of our building relationships, we continue to move forward, sharing information, answering questions, giving both within the church and within healthcare the reasons for the faith that is within us. There is so much that we could say. There is so much we could share. And I sense that there is much on which we don't really always agree. But that should not deter us from continued conversation, continued dialogue, and sharing of ideas. I believe the best is yet to come. And I'd like to, with attribution to John Yates in a recent op-ed that he wrote, refer to the experience of John Stott, such a well-known Bible student, apologist, and theologian. The inspiration he shared to many of us. And Yates described seeing John Stott wearily rubbing his temples, and he would say, "I have a terrible case of PIM." PIM, his acronym stood for pain in the mind. It is his way of describing what it felt like to wrestle over a difficult writing project or a seemingly intractable project. Have you had pain in the mind? As we pored over the topics being discussed, even in these last 2 days, it's caused many of you and me pain in the mind. Certain tasks, he would say, cannot be done without pain in the mind. They are rarely fun, but always worthwhile. John Stott's natural gifts as a communicator did not relieve him of the struggle of careful study and the strain required for understanding God's word and applying it in the modern world. He also had another acronym which he used. It was called the BBC. No, not British Broadcasting Corporation, but the Balanced Biblical Christianity. He was not afraid of taking an unpopular stance if scripture required it. He came to carefully considered judgment rooted in scriptures. So what do I wish for our future, for our collaboration, for the church? Because I said the best is yet to come. I wish that we will cultivate, facilitate, and share more pain in the mind opportunities that, as in John Stott's case, created a thick community around himself of astonishingly different people rooted in the grace of Christ. It's a marvelous image of what the church can be for a world plagued by division and indifference. And then we can truly live Micah 6:8. What is good, what the Lord requires of me, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with my God. My prayer for each of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Landless. We have just a few minutes to take up any questions. I've been trying to monitor what's coming through the chat here. One of the questions that's kind of obvious, I suppose, but I'd like to hear how you would address it. And one of our participants raised this kind of question. You have a worldwide church with health ministries in many different cultures. How do you write any statement that can be effective in all those different places, given the different understandings that people have of what their faith means in practical terms in those settings? What would you say about that?
Absolutely correct. How would we do it? With great difficulty. That's one of our hugest problems. As we look at how the demographics of the church have changed over the last 40 years, how there's been a change from the balance of what has been called North and South, right until now, North America has provided the majority of the support for the World Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's only recently that the balance is beginning to move into a much more diverse field. But at the same time, it's not only the diversity of nations, it's, as you've pointed out, the understanding definitions. For example, one of the issues that led to such heated debate over the recent abortion statement was the misunderstanding of what people understand by the term abortion. And we're not going to go into all of that now, but addressing a group of very, very careful health professionals from a territory far away from us. I tackled this issue saying, so what do you do when you've treated a patient with an ectopic pregnancy, and you've removed that ectopic pregnancy? Oh, they said, we just throw it away. I said, that's a termination. Suddenly the lights went on as to the kind of framework, and these are professionals, and let's not be in any ways denigrating of who they are, excellent people. But as has been pointed out, different language, different backgrounds, different cultural approaches. And when we've heard so much of the negative components and discussion about abortion in this country, they see any termination as that. So yeah, it's extremely difficult. And there is the attempt in all of our work to try and bring as many diverse cultures together. It was very interesting to see this happen when the statement recently was crafted and voted on racism, ethnocentrism, all the isms. And I was delighted to see that statement come to the light of day. But it was also interesting that it took an interesting conversation to bring wording in which would bring out the thought of an apology. And interestingly, probably most accepted and most appreciated by people like me who come from Africa. And looking at the diversity of understanding what racism means, we know that it's a worldwide phenomenon. But when you come to crafting church statements for a diverse group, representing so many cultures and territories, extremely difficult. But it happens. And that's when I think, and it takes intense conversation, it takes discussion, it takes vulnerability, it takes the ability to say, I'm sorry, and it takes the intentionality to come back and revisit what we haven't done right in the past.
Just down to the last few minutes now, Dr. Landless. Thank you for not shying away from some of the more controversial issues. Probably the most difficult one we faced over many years has been the question of abortion. As you know, perhaps all too painfully, our health systems are frequently misrepresented in cyberspace, in the so-called social media, which turn out in some cases to be sort of anti-social media. And I don't know what we can do to address the misinformation together. I see people on here. I see one person I know specializes, for example, in high-risk obstetrical care. And one of the things that has concerned us, I think, all is how do we address that sort of controversial issue in a way that still allows us to provide the best clinical care in complex cases. I think it's fair to say that the 1992 document, which served as a basis for the policies for many of our health systems, including the one where I work, was viewed generally as being helpful, but the turn toward what was viewed as a more restrictive stance in 2019 was not as welcomed. And maybe you can comment just a little bit more about what was really driving the change that seemed to be in the direction of a more restrictive stance.
I think much of it, Jerry, was because of what is you have described why it probably took place. It's because of the disinformation, misinformation that was shared by and is still being shared by so many. And I'd like to just point out to you that there's something here that we worked very hard to see come into that statement. And that is, in situations including rare and extreme cases where human conception may produce pregnancies with fatal prospects and or acute life-threatening birth abnormalities presenting individuals and couples with exceptional dilemmas, Adventist hospitals, healthcare institutions, and health professionals are urged to do everything to preserve the lives of mother and baby. Both are precious in His sight. Now, respecting the doctor-patient relationship and also to respect the conscience and the choice of the individuals. One of the things that was a red rag to a bull, as it were, to a number of people was when I wanted, and we had it in the previous statement, there was much more description, which personally I would have preferred to see in the current one. But the healthcare institutions, and we then wrote a Principles of Caring, which is a short guideline, as it were, which says that each institution needs to pull its ethics committee together, draw up its guidelines, and use its clinical settings to make these decisions in a multidisciplinary fashion. And I think that to an extent meets, in fact, I think it does meet the ability to practice high-tech, very good medicine. Maybe not as ideally as a very detailed, described guideline, but I think it gives the opportunity for what, and when those of us who were very outspoken about this, there were those both on the committee and also in annual council who regarded that paragraph 6 as an end run, just to open the door, the floodgates. We know the healthcare institutions aren't doing that. It was not that. It was to permit best humane practices in a setting where we have healthcare as a primary good objective to serve the whole being.
Thank you again, Dr. Landless. I won't be able to express sufficiently the gratitude I feel for your willingness to take time out of an incredibly busy schedule to address these issues and to do so with candor. I hope all of you will return after a 15-minute break. I see Dr. Marissa Leslie already here, a new friend to me, and she will be introduced by Ann Rhoda, known to many of you, and in about 15 minutes from now to talk about something remarkably important, ethical issues in mental health. So please come back for that, but let's take a 15-minute break now, and we'll see you soon. Hope the break was useful. For some of you, that might have been all the time you're going to get for lunch just now. For others, maybe it's a mid-afternoon break. Our convener for this next session is Ann Rhoda, who's Vice President for Mission Integration and Spiritual Care for Adventist Healthcare, our affiliated organization on the East Coast. Ann, nice to see you there. Thank you for not only hosting this session and convening it, but also for asking for it initially. As I recall, you were one of the ones that thought we should include this very important topic. So please introduce our speaker and lead us into this session.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Winslow. Dr. Marissa Leslie is both a colleague and a friend. She is passionate about educating people on the importance of paying attention to both the physical and mental health that leads to wholeness and true healing. Dr. Leslie is the System Medical Director of Psychiatry for Adventist Healthcare, where she also serves on the Board of Trustees. And because she's got a lot of spare time, she's also the Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychiatry for Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. She specializes in treating depression and PTSD in children and adolescents with an academic interest in immigrant and refugee trauma. Dr. Leslie holds a Doctor of Medicine degree from Loma Linda University, where she also completed her residency in psychiatry. She then moved all the way to the East Coast and completed a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. She is a wife and a mother to a beautiful daughter. She has worked with youth in her personal life as a big sister and youth club instructor as well. And she believes in the ability of every child to thrive and succeed with support and mentorship. So Dr. Leslie will be presenting this afternoon on the ethical issues in mental health. Dr. Leslie, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Ann, for that generous introduction. And thank you to this consortium. Before I begin, I have to give my flowers while I can, and I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Brian Bull, who was the Dean of Loma Linda when I was a wee lad medical student, and acknowledgement to Loma Linda for helping me discover my path. I truly love what I do. So I'm going to share my screen, and please engage. I really prefer presentations when I have participation from the audience. Can you see my presentation? Ann, can you let me know?
No, not yet.
Not yet? Okay. Oh, all right, let's try this then. I think I have to press share, of course. Okay. What about now?
All right. We
All right.
see it. Thank you.
Got it. Great. So let's get into it. Nope. It's not letting me. There we go. Okay. Today, I'd like to review with you the impact of mental health issues when it comes to ethics. And disclaimer, I will probably leave you with more questions than answers because that's how I felt reading about it and preparing for the presentation. I'd also like to discuss social and cultural issues of mental health, ethics and justice, mental health ethics in diagnosis and patient-centered care, as well as advanced directives in mental health and decision-making during crises. I'll present 2 cases, and I would love a robust question and answer. So I will make sure we provide enough time for that. Wish there was a way I could do full screen. All right, so the general principles to consider, as I learned, there is a principlist view to ethics and there's the narrative view, and I hope to incorporate both. But hopefully as we discuss this, you'll find the principles of beneficence, doing well, autonomy, justice, and non-maleficence, not doing any harm. Here are some global statistics when it comes to psychiatry and mental health. The World Health Organization says that mental health and substance use are the leading causes of disability worldwide. Mental health is a major contributor to the overall global burden of disease, and the median number of practicing psychiatrists worldwide is 0.1 per 10,000 people. In the US, those stats are a little better. I guess on factors, it's much better, but in reality, it's still not great here. 1.2 per 10,000 people. But more than half of US counties do not have a single practicing behavioral health worker. And that's not just psychiatry, that's social work, that's any kind of mental health professional. And the average wait time for a first outpatient psychiatry visit in large urban areas, which means better staffed, is 25 days, which if you've ever been in a mental health crisis or had a loved one in a mental health crisis is too long. Okay, the cost needed to scale up care for depression and anxiety in 36 countries was over 15 years is an estimated 147 billion. And so how does this affect ethics? As with everything, it seems as if you live in the right area or you have the right amount of money, you get more access, which is that right? That's something you should consider. And of course, parity. And in the US, parity for me means that what's reimbursed for other issues is not reimbursed at the same rate in mental health, which then leads to scarcer resources for a vulnerable population. Some unique ethical challenges to consider in psychiatry. Questions that I pondered in preparing for this and that I've read. How do we best address decision-making in complex psychiatric cases when reality testing and insight are the primary symptoms of disease? Do patients have the right to be, quote, crazy, a word I don't like, but that's what a lot of people identify, or mentally ill? Do they have that right? Is psychiatric diagnosis too subjective? And the background to that is that whereas we have a lot of cardiac research and a lot of neurologic research when it comes to stroke and other disease processes, when it comes to mental health symptoms like depression, like anxiety, our research is still lacking. We can trace heredity, but when it comes to specific genetic sites or specific disease processes outside of, is this part of the brain well perfused, we don't have many biomarkers. So it's still quite subjective. And if you know the history of psychiatry and when it was misused, I'm thinking about concentration camps or in places that engage in genocide, subjective psychiatric diagnoses can be dangerous. So it's something to ponder. We have a lack of full understanding of the pathophysiology, as I mentioned, as well as how medications truly work. I think we see that they work, but we don't always know why they work. And should depression ever be considered a terminal illness? Does racism lead to an imbalance of experienced mental illness? What do I even mean by that? Well, we talk about from a medical ethics perspective or social justice or even just a societal concern perspective, racism is wrong. But have we ever thought about how racism affects the health of the individual and of generations? And given my academic interest in post-traumatic stress, there is a clear link to intergenerational trauma and how the trauma affects the brain and changes visible parts of the brain through imaging, but how that can be passed on to literal generations. So does racism actually lead to more trauma or mental illness or post-traumatic stress reactions? Does it create less tolerance for treatment from the vulnerable ethnic population? A brief history of ethics and mental health. The earliest form of medical ethics in writing is the Hippocratic Oath in the 5th century. First, do no harm, and of course, really focusing on the patient instead of the self as a professional. Modern day medical ethics are ascribed to Thomas Percival, 1803, in his writing Medical Ethics, or a Code of Institutes and Precepts. These foundations served as a key source of the American Medical Association Code of Ethics. Now, psychiatric ethics actually need to go further. They need to go beyond the ethical standards of general medicine due to the presence of stigma and socioeconomic disadvantages, often present in the mentally ill population. So if you take other vulnerable issues like ethnicity or gender, mental illness itself is a disadvantage for many, given the day's loss of work, the ability to work, the ability to be around other people, the ability to care for yourself and make sound decisions in some of the mentally ill. I think another thing I should point out is ethics and mental illness often focus on the most vulnerable. Hopefully we all know, with a 1 in 5 statistic, we probably have all been affected by mental health issues. It's not just what happens when something goes wrong, but how to maintain good mental health. So it affects all of us, but the ethical discussion will focus on some of the most vulnerable. So cultural issues. Despite responsibility to do so, physicians, we often lack training in how to address ethical quandaries in patients from diverse backgrounds. And remember that diversity is not always visible. So it's not just the color of our skin. It could also be the diversity of our experiences, of our family backgrounds, of our sexual orientation. How can we affect these and approach these issues ethically? So here's the first case I'd like for us to think about. And this is from the journal Focus. Maria is a 25-year-old undocumented Latina woman. She works as a strawberry picker. Her cousin brought her to a rural psychiatric emergency services facility. She was concerned about her worsening depression and intermittent suicidal thoughts. Her cousin speaks some English and can interpret for Maria, who is primarily Spanish speaking. As the psychiatrist in the emergency room, you learn that Maria was quite reluctant to come today, although she acknowledges that she could use psychiatric attention. With the help of a hospital interpreter, you obtain further history that Maria had seen her primary care doctor for depression. Although that physician prescribed an antidepressant, Maria has taken this medication only intermittently because she did not understand the English directions on the prescription bottle. She has never seen a psychiatrist. On the basis of your clinical assessment, you believe that she is at high risk of attempting suicide and feel that the degree of suicidality is severe and warrants inpatient hospitalization. Your treatment plan in these kinds of cases is typically to transfer the patient to the nearest psych unit, but that's 50 miles away. On discussing this plan with her, Maria pleads that she cannot be hospitalized because she fears that she will lose the support of her family as well as her job if she misses a day of work because of mental illness. She is willing to contract for safety, however. In addition, she promises to follow up with her primary care physician within a week. What is the next best step in the clinical management of this patient? You don't have to answer, but if you have thoughts, please feel free to put them in the chat. Do you discharge with outpatient follow-up in 1 week? Do you place a psychiatric hold and immediately pursue transfer to an inpatient psych facility? Do you place a psych hold, but delay the transfer until a period of observation? Do you ask the patient whether she will stay voluntarily in psych emergency services for a longer observation? Do you give the patient the address of a nearby hospital with a psych ward and ask her to request voluntary psych admission? And I'll just add, this is very, very true and real, and this is what we encounter in our 140-bed psych facility in Rockville, Maryland. The other caveat is her undocumented status places her at major legal risk. If she is involuntarily committed, she risks deportation. And one thing I've learned over the years is we talk about, in California, it's a 5150, in your state, it's some other legal statute, but the involuntary commitment of a person suffering severe mental illness, a crisis, is not a light thing. It can affect their employment. It can affect a lot of rights that we take for granted. And in this case, it could completely change the trajectory of her life. So it's not a light thing, but my concern is that many of our physicians and social workers and even nurses don't fully appreciate the gravity that we encounter because it's so routine to us to involuntarily commit people. Now to delve into ethics and justice in mental health. The 1960s are considered the modern era of modern healthcare, of mental health care. And this is why. In that time period in the US, there was extensive deinstitutionalization. Before, psychiatry was probably the stereotype you think. You're months on end in a bucolic setting with other severely mentally ill people, locked doors, a lot of smoking outside or inside, but you're really committed to this state hospital system. There were allegations that psychiatry was used as social control, and indeed, historically, it has been used as social control, but that wasn't the objective. Some contributing factors to this modern era include the US Civil Rights Movement, and also increasing federal funding for community mental health, renewed optimism that medications could actually work, and litigation leading to decisions vindicating the rights of persons with mental illness. And the example is the case of O'Connor versus Donaldson in the mid-70s. Federal policies also increased the availability of services. And to show you the impact, in 1956, the average daily census was 551,390, and the population was 169 million. In 2004, the average daily census of psych institutions was 51,000, and the population at that time was 271 million. So you can see the drastic decrease there. So there's a legal and ethical discourse during this period of deinstitutionalization that focused on this tension between benevolence and patient autonomy. And I'm here to tell you it's very alive and well today. Every Thursday in our facility, we have hearings with an administrative law judge, and we have a public defender for our patients, and we have our social workers who are acting as legal representatives, and we have the doctors testifying, and we have the patient. And our clinical team often will work with patients who are quite ill and we're really concerned about, and we don't want them out on the streets, either in the cold or in the heat, with no protection. But if we cannot make a compelling case about harm, they are released. And the lawyer's view, and I'm not making any judgments, I'm just presenting, is that it's the patient's right to be ill. I mentioned that earlier. And they focus on the civil rights, where we focus on the benevolence. And so I don't know where this will head, but I know in Maryland, it really leans toward benevolence. I'd love to hear how this plays out in your state or country. Physicians act to benefit the patients. That's our oath. But patients want autonomy. Courts have narrow criteria to justify involuntary hospitalization, and we often encounter family members, loved ones who are besides themselves. How could you let my loved one go in this condition? And this is how. The criteria are quite narrow. They really have to be a danger. They could be psychotic, as psychotic can be, and they could still be released. There's also the ability to administer medications forcibly to legally committed patients, and courts have narrow criteria for that too. The current iteration of this tension is an approach called mandated outpatient treatment. I would love to hear if your state or region has this codified. In Maryland, this issue had come up and was shot down. The judges and the lawyers were quite effective and did not believe in it. But mandated outpatient treatment is a possible resolution to this tension. It's appealing because it balances the beneficence of helping people get treatment while utilizing the least restrictive method by having a person in an outpatient setting, and hopefully preventing hospitalization, which is ultimately our goal. Other policy strands include empowerment of the patient. And I heard this yesterday, and I held on to it, nothing about me without me. And we want to embrace that. The recovery model of mental health. Before, it really was just chronic disease management, but what's really popular and empowering now is helping people recover from their mental illness, which is different from cure. So in the addiction world, in the world of addiction is ever present, but it is possible to obtain sobriety and recover while managing a chronic illness. And the same thing is true for other mental illnesses. There's also the view of seeing mental illness as a chronic condition, something that is chronically managed, not just an episodic condition. There's the view of empowering patients to take personal responsibility for management of this chronic condition and assisting them to take control of their treatment via an advance directive. So an advance directive in mental health works this way. My understanding of it is when they are well, when a person is well, they then write out legally, what do they want? What kind of treatment do they want? So that when they're not well and not capable of making decisions, the people who are can fulfill those. Do they not like a certain group of medication? Do they prefer to live independently? Do they prefer group homes? And the treatment team and the surrogate decision maker would then take that into consideration and respect the patient's wishes. And there's the view that an advance directive should be a part of routine care. It should be an explicit goal of contemporary mental health policy, and I think that's very empowering. So bias in mental health diagnosis. Bias, as defined by Snowden in 2003, occurs when unfounded assumptions become normative beliefs. There's this shared understanding. Shared understandings might include biases about the mental health status or treatment expectations for ethnic minority clients. The clients or patients from certain backgrounds are unreceptive to treatment, hostile, naive, superstitious, or otherwise unpromising. It might represent a prevailing view in a practitioner network or organization, and this is absolutely possible, and we've seen it. There are some studies that show that bipolar disorder and schizophrenia were overdiagnosed in the African American community. And you can think why, but obviously culture plays a huge role. How I manifest my sadness, my belief in deceased loved ones visiting me, how if a practitioner is atheist or has a different spiritual tradition, they could see that as psychosis and then subjectively misdiagnose the person from a different background. I want us to view this video, but I think I'll do it after just because I want to make sure we cover everything. But this is a video about bias. So here's the second case. The names and details have been changed to protect identity. This is a real case. Jack is a 20-year-old male with lifelong severe autism and intellectual disability. Jack's parents are also his legal guardians, which is not a short process, so they took the time and they saw the importance of this. They've experienced significant aggression and challenges with having Jack in the home. Jack has 2 younger siblings. He's been accepted by a therapeutic group home to better address his needs. So we're considering the youth in the home. However, here are some barriers. Jack is hypersexual. He grabs at his genitalia and others, and this is a risk to accepting him. So the question to the ethics meeting I attended was, is it ethical to perform an orchiectomy, remove his testicles, to ensure success in the group home? I don't know if you've encountered this, but the ethics committee had many things to consider, and just to briefly summarize, a lot of the things that the committee considered was, were least restrictive methods exhausted? Is a psychiatrist engaged? Is there actually psychological testing? Basically, have other things been exhausted? And due to Jack's limited verbal ability, Jack was likely experiencing something very developmentally normal, which is a higher sex drive at his age. It's just that he didn't have the words or the developmental ability to express it appropriately. However, other people have, with behavioral interventions, been able to do that. So is this ethical of the guardians to ask, and is it ethical of the physician to perform it? And basically, this may be your face and thinking about this case, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. So in summary, and then I actually would like to hear Q&A first, and then if we have time, I'll show the video. I told you I was going to leave you with more questions than answers after this presentation. Psychiatric ethics need to go beyond the general medical ethics due to the presence of stigma and disadvantages often present in this population. Modern mental health ethics are focused on balancing autonomy with justice and exploring the least restrictive treatment that allows for fair, equal, and helpful access to care. Always consider the implications of bias in access, diagnosis, and treatment recommendations. Consider mental health advance directives as a routine part of care when you're balancing autonomy with beneficence. Mental health ethics are wonderfully complex interplays of legal allowances, societal commentary, and reflection, learning from history and opportunities to ponder broad issues of equity, justice, health empowerment, and creating compassionately innovative approaches to care. Would love to hear your thoughts. I'll stop sharing for now just so we can see each other.
Now we have, Dr. Leslie, we have everyone muted. We can try to monitor people who raise their hands, but the easiest thing, if you have a question or comment, is probably just to use that share chat, the chat function. And Anne will trust you to kind of direct questions there.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Leslie. That was very thought-provoking, and you're right. There is a lot more questions than there are answers, and perhaps that's the space that we need to sit in right now, and it's okay to sit in that space. Somebody asked a question in regards to the first case study. I think that her name was Maria. Was she assessed for human trafficking victim, as a human trafficking victim, or a sex human traffic victim?
This is a case from a journal, so it's not a case I'm intimately familiar with, but that would be appropriate to assess for that. The undocumented population is certainly at risk. You know, Anne jokingly said with my free time, which I have none, but one of my ways to give back is I provide pro bono asylum evaluations to asylum seekers. And so for someone who is entering the United States and declaring asylum from their country of origin, trafficking is huge, either during the immigration process as a result of being so vulnerable and being off the radar. It's definitely something to consider. So that's an excellent point.
All right, and Mark Carr, you had given a comment about a documentary called Seattle is Dying. Could you, through the chat, just maybe explain a little bit more about what this is? And I wasn't quite sure where in Dr. Leslie's presentation this came in, so I don't have a context for that, but it certainly sounds very interesting. And I think our audience might be interested in that particular documentary.
And Mark, I'm wondering if you're referring to the homelessness people experience.
Yes, exactly. And how society is adjusting itself. You noted, I think appropriately, the 60s when the deinstitutionalization of so many people that we had just put away somewhere. And these many years later, in the wake of a failure of mental health care broadly established, where are these people, sorry to use the phrase, where are the people who need this kind of care ending up? And that documentary shows a very troubled reality, if you will, of we're somewhere between a full institutionalization and a full ability to navigate life. So how do we address that? Thank you.
No, excellent point. What I see in the DC area, you know, some of our patients will say, I would rather be on the street than in a shelter because the shelters are just awfully traumatic places. You know, they worry about their belongings, they worry about being sexually victimized, and there are just so many difficult choices in this space. If housing was more affordable and more reasonable, and employers were a lot more forgiving of legal transgressions, which occur more in this population and more in ethnic populations and poorer communities, perhaps people would have more employment, perhaps people would have more housing. For our really quite ill patients, there is residential treatment that Medicaid may pay for, but there just are not enough beds. There aren't enough group homes. Group homes don't pay. Residential treatment centers don't pay. I don't want to sound alarmist. It is a crisis, but I'll check out that documentary. Thank you for suggesting it.
Dr. Leslie, there's a question here that was presented asking if you can talk about empowerment and decolonization. If you can expound on that a little bit more.
If I could, by decolonization, you mean countries or territories that were previously colonized by other governments, powers? Is that what the person?
I unfortunately, I don't have that clarification. I'm looking down at the chat to see if this individual has, no, I really don't have any clarification on that.
That's fine. Well, let's see. I think they will. Oh, I think this is from Ramana.
Yes. Okay. Actually, they said yes.
Empowerment and decolonization. big topic, right? And it's one that's actually near and dear to my heart. My mother's family is from Haiti, And they fled because my grandfather was on a literal kill list. And so the United States were very grateful for changing the trajectory of our families' lives. Empowerment and decolonization. So Haiti is an example of a group of people that took charge and liberated themselves and paid for it. So I do think that, you know, decolonization and empowering the populations is important. I think that it's important for the world community to acknowledge that they're not starting on an equal footing. So Haiti has been terribly exploited, deforested, a country of such rich resources. I remember my grandparents who are now passed and their stories of what Haiti was like and how safe it was, but also how it became very militarized under a different political regime. I think empowerment is something to think about when it comes to ethics applied to the global community. But empowerment can also take this tone of like, you know, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which I don't believe in, because I acknowledged Dr. Bull and Loma Linda. I did not get here on my own. You know, it's because people poured into me, and I would assume you too. So that whole concept of empowerment has to be balanced with support, you know, empowering support. That's what I would say to that.
Dr. Leslie, we have a comment and here about a real keen interest in the idea of mental illness being considered a terminal illness. And the example that was given was one of my most haunting cases was a medical student with anorexia nervosa who had multiple relapses and eventually died from her illness. Can you unpack a little bit more about this idea of mental health as terminal illness? I mean, we usually don't think of it in those terms. Help us understand that a little bit more.
Sure, absolutely. In general, we don't talk about mental health, right? If someone has cancer, we have GoFundMes, we have prayers, vigils, and we make food and we visit. Mental illness is so isolating. Most people don't feel comfortable saying, oh, I'm dealing with another bout of depression. You know, I was suicidal again last week. Where are the GoFundMes for people who have lost income because of their depression, right? So if we were to embrace mental illness as we do medical, physical illness, or, you know, honestly, the reality is mental illness is a medical illness. We just don't treat it that way. Then that are terminal, right? There are certain cancers that are terminal. If you get to a certain point in your heart failure, it may be terminal. And there are instances of depression that are terminal, and there are instances of anorexia nervosa that are terminal. I think that the challenge is the spiritual component, because I'm no theologian, but there's this view that if you commit suicide, you know, where does the soul go? And I think that when you start to view something like suicide as an outcome of a chronic illness, you may think differently about that. I'm not here to give you the theological answer. I'm here to add a different component to it. And, you know, I haven't thankfully worked with many patients who've actually completed suicide, but there was one recently, not mine, but a colleague of mine. And I'm telling you, this person was just intent. You know, there's the whole right to die movement. This person wanted the right to die, and there was almost nothing we could do to prevent this person from taking his life. And as we were talking to our staff, and Anne and Chaplain Korea, you may be familiar with this situation. What we said to the staff was, depression is an illness, and sometimes the outcome is death. And when we talk about death in the medical setting, you know, it's not that we take it for granted or it becomes routine, but we are not surprised at the outcome. And unfortunately, sometimes the depression is so severe and the people are suffering so much. I'm not advocating to help them end their lives by any means, but it is an outcome. It is an outcome. And I don't know if that will help any individual today who has lost someone to suicide. But I think if we saw it more as I lost a brother to cancer. I actually did at 21. And when I think about him lovingly, fondly. There's not guilt. I was there. We had the GoFundMes, we had the prayer vigils. And I also lost a dear friend to suicide from high school. And I try to apply that same thought. I think about her lovingly. I mourn for the suffering she was experiencing. But I don't think, oh my goodness, she was so weak. There are just things that we say that in mental illness that we just don't say when people die of cancer. So I think that's where thinking about it as a terminal illness may be different, helpful, comforting, whatever, however you view this. But I think it's time we start thinking about some mental illness as terminal.
Dr. Leslie, on the subject of suicide, there was a question that came in that states, does attempting suicide automatically indicate that a patient is mentally ill? And then a secondary question, maybe not completely related, but can a mentally ill patient have capacity to make life or death decisions?
Yeah, these are excellent questions. The first answer is no, it does not necessarily mean someone's mentally ill. In an overwhelming majority, I can't remember the exact statistic, it might be like 70% of completed suicides, the person had depression, which is why we screen for depression, all patients. But there are some people and some cultures. I don't know enough about the Japanese culture, but I know there are some cultures where suicide is an act of honor. After something that may be dishonorable. So it's complex. If we're going to be that black and white about it, no, it doesn't always mean mental illness, but in overwhelming number of cases, yes, it does. And the second question, Anne, could you repeat that for me?
Can a mentally ill patient have the capacity to make life or death decisions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It all depends on their decision-making capacity. So a psychiatrist, and this is something that was hammered into me in medical school and residency, I, as a physician, can comment on the decision-making capacity of a person. I cannot comment on their competency. That's actually up to a judge. So yes, if someone is mentally ill and we're being broad here, I'm going to assume you mean severely mentally ill, maybe, and psychotic. It depends. Do they have reality testing? There may be people who have hallucinations, and hallucinations also occur as a result of trauma, who can still make decisions. They still have capacity. They understand the nature of the decision they need to make. They understand the nature of their illness. They understand the consequences, the benefits, risk, and alternatives. That's what it takes. It doesn't mean that you never have a hallucination or that you've never attempted suicide. You just need to have decision-making capacity.
Here is a comment and perhaps a bit of a question that relates back to the case that you talked about, Dr. Leslie, about the patient that was just determined to commit suicide, and it talks a little bit about this idea of terminal disease. About 10 years ago, this is the comment of the question. About 10 years ago, during my first palliative care job, I had a patient with severe depression with recurrent suicide attempts. Patient wanted to die even after psychiatric intervention, meds, etc. With such refractory disease, could this patient have been considered to have a terminal disease and to consider hospice care?
Yes, that's that's a tough one. I've never recommended hospice care for someone with severe depression. But I would consider, I'd love to see more palliative care for people with severe mental illness. You know, there are people who have endured the unimaginable, and God is amazing. I believe God is a healer. I believe in the ability of God's healing power to transform people. At the same time, God understands, and I think that's why he says, you know, if you harm one of these children, it's better that a stone be hung around your neck. That trauma is real and lifelong. It can impact you for so long. There are some things that would just break many people, that people with mental illness are suffering. So I definitely don't have the answer, but I think that, you know, thinking about palliative care, it's why we have disability for mental illness. We understand some people, their level of functioning is such, if they just need to get up, get dressed, socialize, work is too much. Maybe their work is different from the work you're used to, but I think it's an interesting concept. And I saw this comment from Jonathan, and I just want to thank you for being transparent. And yes, I think your analogy is beautiful. If it takes some time to read Jonathan's comment.
Dr. Winslow, it looks like we are out of time, but we do have a lot of comments and questions. Doctor, how would you like to handle this? Dr. Leslie, would you like to maybe respond to some of these comments in the chat, or any other suggestions, Dr. Winslow?
You know, I think that could work well if you're willing to do that, Dr. Leslie. You've already been very generous with your time, but you can scan down through these, and during the break, if you want to provide any other comments, that would work well. Let me thank Ann Rhoda for hosting this session, and really thank you very much, Dr. Leslie, for taking the time today. This is the first time in 5 years of conference that we've had this topic. I'm quite sure it won't be the last. We will want to return to this. Many other questions you can see from the vigorous exchanges in the chat. So thank you again, both of you, and we'll take a break now. During these breaks, if you want to, you're certainly welcome to chat with each other. We've decided to leave chat on and leave the link open during the times we're having breaks, just for that purpose. I think of it as the opportunity for hallway conversations that we would have if we were meeting together. So we'll be back at 15 minutes after the hour. And once again, thank you ever so much, Dr. Leslie.
Thank you, Dr. Winslow, for inviting us.
I'm looking for, there he is, Dr. Robert Smith. Dr. Smith is going to convene this session and introduce our speaker. Just a word about Dr. Smith. Bob Smith is the Chief Medical Officer and the Vice President for Medical Affairs at Kettering Health Network. He's also a longtime friend and an accomplished person in biomedical ethics, and one of the presenters of an important webinar that we did in December. So Bob, thanks for convening this, and we'll turn the time over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Jerry. Good afternoon, everyone from beautiful Ohio. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Edwin I. Hernandez, who is the president of AdventHealth University, also a research affiliate with the Center of Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. Ed is a sociologist of religion, receiving his PhD from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Divinity from Andrews University. Now for the name-dropping part of the introduction. He graduated from La Sierra University and was Professor Richard Rice's reader. Say that, it's very alliterative. And the I in his name, I've been told on good authority, his middle initial I stands for Ivan, named for Dr. Ivan Blazin, a professor at both Andrews and Loma Linda. Ed's topic this afternoon is Bioethics Needs Assessment Survey. My subtitle might be, I wonder what everyone else's ethics committee is doing. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. And somebody must have spoken to you a few tidbits about my history, my life, but real privileged with my association and mentor, Dr. Richard Rice, and of course, Ivan Blazin with my father. So those are the connections. This afternoon, colleagues, let me share my screen. With all of you, let me make sure that, let me see, just a moment. Let me try that again. And can you, there we go. Do you see a front page title, Bioethics Assessment Study?
Yes, we can see that. If you want, Ed, you can change it to the full presentation mode, but it doesn't, either way, we can see it just fine.
Okay. All right, thank you, colleagues. This was a study that was led by a group of AdventHealth faculty, AdventHealth leaders. It was inspired by Dr. Ted Hamilton at our Mission and Ministry office to try to advance a very important set of objectives, which I will get to in a minute. We devised a mixed method approach that we asked, obviously, some close-ended questions, open-ended questions. It was done in one point in time. It was anonymous, online survey, purposefully selected, meaning that we targeted 5 members of the leadership of the facilities. The Chief Executive Officer, CMO, CNO, Risk Manager, Senior Chaplain. And there you see the results, great participation overall, representing the facilities as well as participants. And the data collection process was right in the middle of last spring and ended in June 2020. We were interested in understanding the infrastructure of bioethics within AdventHealth facilities. And we identified a number of objectives that you see listed there, from awareness to the role of bioethics, to membership in the bioethics committees, to the issues that ethics committees were struggling or addressing, processes of how ethics issues get processed, issues of training. And then finally, we were also interested in getting information to help advance the important mission of Adventist Bioethics Consortium that we are all part of and of course participating today. So now today I'm going to share with you some highlights of the survey. There are many more information, but we have just selected a few for today's purpose to allow us time to discuss at the end. If you can go to the next slide. Sorry, colleague. There we go. That's the team, colleagues. I spoke about that. The next screen talks about our methods that we used. Again, in this study, colleagues, we've targeted 5 key leaders from each facility within AdventHealth. We had great response rate from the facilities and participants, but it happened during the pandemic, so we had some challenges there. That's just a little background information. This was done right as it was starting and ending, so that's a little context to the work. The next slide shares with you the objectives of our study. The needs assessment was to understand the infrastructure within AdventHealth. We had a number of objectives related to a level of awareness, the role of bioethics, the committee structure, the training needs, what ethical issues were being addressed within the committees. We wanted to understand the resources available. And of course, at the end of the day, we also wanted to understand awareness and the use of the Adventist Bioethics Consortium. What we're going to share with you today is a snippet of the results. We are writing a full report on the findings, but today we'll present a snippet, and I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. But first of all, this is the sample. The participants, a large number of chaplains, CEOs, CNOs, CMOs represented in the sample. The next slide shares with you what we asked the question, is there a clinical ethics or its equivalent committee in your facility? There you have the breakdown. Of course, ethics committees are now mandated federally. They're done on a facility by facility. But this gives you an initial sense that it doesn't exist in all facilities at the moment. The next slide shares with you the membership. What is the membership of the committees? Of course, chaplains, they were overrepresented in our sample, but it gives you a sense that chaplains, physicians, there's a great variety of professionals that participate. But notice at the very bottom that there were few clinical ethicists or academic ethicists involved in the committees. We'll come back to this. This is an important finding because ethicists, obviously professional ethicists, and their consultation and availability is important. The next slide also talks about who chairs these committees. So for example, it's no surprise that physicians do share most of these committees. But there were an interesting number that weren't sure who shares the committees, but there's a bit of a variety of roles, chaplains, risk managers, etc. When we asked the question, the next slide, about the schedule of committees to try to understand to what degree are ethics committees embedded within the culture of the institution. Notice that the majority of respondents, the largest number was that as needed. We meet as needed. 25% monthly, quarterly. And then of course, leaders, there was about 9% that said, we're not sure how often it meets. So again, this gives evidence of to what degree are bioethics committees institutionalized within the facilities. To the next question, we asked about the issues. What issues? Notice the preponderance, the large amount of end-of-life issues that ethics committees, followed by surrogate decisions, futility of care, and so forth. Look at the bottom issues that got very few beginning of life issues and so forth, but this gives us an understanding of the sorts of issues. Now, I want to be clear that we gave these options to the respondents. So they selected from within these categories that we provided. And then we asked a critical question about effectiveness. The next slide tells us the level of overall, how would they rate? If given a rate and scale between 1, poor, to 10, excellent, this was the overall response there. 40% would say that our infrastructure is relatively poor, that it could improve, and only 40% on the other hand. Again, it gives us a glimpse of leaders telling us that there is potentially significant room for improving the ethics infrastructure. And then we asked an open-ended question. The next slide summarizes 4 important categories. We had close to over 100 responses. These are, we analyzed the content analysis of those responses, and these are 4 major themes. Opportunity. We have many indicated that we have an opportunity to grow, to develop regular standing, that this is part of what we should be doing. Communications. There were a lot of comments about the need for better communications between the committee, the rest of the facilities, that we assume that people know about committees and how they meet and how often. There was a lot of comments about the lack of regular education, awareness, training. And finally, there was a lot of optimism at the same time to develop, strengthen what we're doing. There were comments about COVID-19. Of course, keep in mind when we were collecting this data right in the middle of the pandemic. And so the optimism and the sense of opportunity was related to this moment where a lot of issues were being brought to mind for the respondents. And then we asked an important question, follow up to the next slide, is how often do clinical ethics committees are evaluated? We found that, again, a large majority did not know how often the committees are evaluated for its effectiveness. Large number, again, 29% said never. Again, opportunities to assess our quality, how well we're doing the work, how much training. Again, the importance of bioethics committees signaling opportunities for evaluation and assessment. The next slide, when we ask the question, do you have an ongoing educational process for the members? Again, notice that 43% said no, we don't have educational process for clinical ethics committee members. And a large number just weren't sure, they weren't aware. Again, indicating opportunities for education, training. The next slide talks about, do you have a formal process to orienting the new members? Again, orienting new members into what the functions are, what are the key issues, how important is the bioethics committee to the mission of the institution? Again, large majority did not know of those that responded to this particular question. When we asked then the follow-up question about the bioethics committee, the Adventist Bioethics Consortium, and Jerry, Dr. Winslow participated with us. We wanted to know the reach of the consortium within AdventHealth facilities. So again, many people, key leaders, those 5 informants were not aware. By the way, the largest number of those that were aware of the consortium were chaplains. By far, they were the ones that were more likely to be aware of the consortium. And then when we asked the question, how have you used the consortium? Notice that those that did know about the consortium, which were about 26, the majority of which were chaplains, notice that education, training, coming to the conferences, the review of the guidelines, and so forth. So in summary, or then one more slide, how have you used so go ahead. When we asked them so as a result of the work that we've done, we've come up with some recommendations that we will be putting forward to within AdventHealth leaders. But we want to engage all of you participants of this conference because we are still learning. We wanted to share these findings with you. So let me share some recommendations, and you may have others. First of all, establish and organize clinical committees in each facility. We think that's important. Communicate broadly the existence. Again, not many key leaders knew, so you would imagine how that might happen elsewhere within the organizations. Be sure that committees are staffed and have access to professional trained ethicists. The next slide continues our recommendations to communicate to the facility leaders who the chair is. Again, we found that there's little knowledge of who chairs, who leads. We also think that if you're going to establish clinical ethics committees, that how are they embedded? How often do you meet? Is a sign of establishment, of being part of the culture. Clarify within each facility who has oversight. We asked this question about who has oversight. To create a climate of trust among team members, particularly to channel ethical concerns. We found that there isn't clarity around how clinicians channel ethical concerns. And of course, a strong recommendation around bioethics education for clinical team members. And then finally, around the question of the strategic areas, the three major functions around policy, guidelines, education, and ethics consultations are important, as well as establishing guidelines. So at the end, let me summarize. Broadly speaking, our findings show the importance of institutionalizing. Secondly, the need for better communications within facilities about the function, the regularity, who's in charge, who's a member. Thirdly, the need for training, education is critical as we move forward. And finally, I think there's a great opportunity for better awareness and the value that the Adventist Bioethics Consortium provides. As a final slide, we want to thank those that participated. Some of you might be in attendance at this particular conference. Thank you for taking the time. We want to thank the Office of Mission and Ministry that we collaborated very closely, and Dr. Ted Hamilton for the inspiration and the support for this project. Now, the final slide is, I have uploaded here some discussion questions to help facilitate. So Dr. Smith, as he facilitates, I know that there are other members of the research team that are here today that can manage some of the questions. But what findings were surprising to you? How important is it to have clinical ethics committees in all Adventist healthcare facilities? Is it important or not? How is it connected to our mission? What other recommendations would you make in light of some of the findings? And what questions does this study raise for you? And so, sorry for the mix-up early on. We got it done just in time, my 20 minutes, and I think we're open for conversation and discussion.
Thank you, Ed. Well done. These are key questions. I think there's some others that are coming through the chat, but let's just take them one by one. I'm interested in everybody's experiences and thoughts from around the consortium. So, what were the most surprising findings to everybody? I saw a lot of I don't knows in there. Jerry, I don't know if you want people to speak or chat or some combination.
You know, we have been going through a process of authorizing people to be unmuted, but if Brady is still with us, Brady, do you have the capacity to unmute everybody so they can just speak up if they want to? Not hearing Brady answer.
I'm sorry, I was taking care of something. Do you mind repeating that, Dr. Winslow?
Yeah, you know, because our group is a bit smaller right now, and because there is time for discussion, can you make it possible for people to unmute themselves?
Sure can. Give me like 2 seconds. And
Jerry, can you hear me?
they are able to unmute themselves this
I'm not
second.
getting feedback.
Yeah, okay. And Edwin, are you not hearing us? Oh dear. Now everyone can be unmuted, but I'm not sure Edwin is hearing us.
So everybody's unmuted. Is Edwin back?
I'm having communications problems, colleagues. Brad, can you unmute on my cell? I came in on my cell.
So yes, I technically don't have the ability to unmute a specific person unless they let me. However, you should be able to unmute yourself on your cell phone right now. Just a word of warning though, Dr. Hernandez, is that if you are hearing if you're holding your cell phone and the computer right next to each other, you're going to get feedback. So I recommend turning down the volume all the way on your laptop and communicating specifically on your phone. However, just a heads up, Dr. Winslow, I allowed everyone to have the ability to unmute themselves, regardless if they are a co-host or not. I could remove that, or I could put that back in place later after this discussion time.
Yeah, well, this is our last session for this day, so we'll revisit that tomorrow. But let's leave it as it is now so that people can unmute themselves. And I'm just looking for a signal that Dr. Hernandez can hear us. I'm not seeing that. I guess we could speak among ourselves while he recovers that. Bob, why don't you take over, and I'll be in touch with Edwin to see if we can repair the audio.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting some interesting chat. I'll just jumpstart by sharing what Kettering's experience was with a similar survey. It's been between 5 and 7 years ago. I took this on within the Kettering network too, and I said, how many ethics committees are there? Who chairs them? What's the constituents? But then I took a little deeper dive, and I said, who does the ethics consults at your facility?
I'm back.
Edwin, welcome back. We were just chatting amongst ourselves. We'll get back here. So I'll just finish with my digression here. So at Kettering, we have 8 hospitals, and at the time that we surveyed, there were 3 ethics committees. So that was less than half. And then it was constituted probably similar to what your survey showed. We've kept it about half physicians, and then other clinical folks, few administrators. We had another professional ethicist always join us on the Kettering ethics committee. But then we took a deeper dive and we addressed the question of who does the ethics consults. And that was interesting because it was chaplains at one place and physicians at another, and patient relations almost at a third. At Kettering, we've taken to when we get an ethics consult, it's interdisciplinary. So there is a chaplain, a clinician, and a patient from, if there's a legal question, either patient relations or someone in legal. And that's how we approach ethics questions until we tease them out a little further. So just kind of a different flavor, different system. But now that Ed has joined us again, let's get back to the general questions of what were some of the more surprising findings in this study, and how do your systems compare, and just start sharing.
Thanks for your patience, colleagues. I had to go out. I came in. I don't know if there were any chat observations, Dr. Smith, in the chat earlier.
Trying to pull up some chat. Mark Carr reminds us that the Joint Commissions just say you have to have a way to deal with it, not formal committees. It'd be interesting to know after that ruling change if some committees went away or just never were reconstituted. But I think part of this is just networks. As you've got bigger hospitals, smaller hospitals, I think that's how I've seen it evolve too, is smaller hospitals less likely to have a full committee, rely on some of the experts in some of the other campuses.
Once again, since I think all of you can unmute yourself if you choose to, we can't all speak at once, but feel free to unmute yourself and just offer comments or questions. One question I have, Edwin, in your system, you have immense hospitals. I understand the largest by volume admitting hospital in the United States, and then you have small hospitals, relatively speaking. Can there be one size that fits all? What's your thinking about that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Winslow. And I'm hoping that Dr. De Leon or Lampkin are here, since both of them are members and leaders. But yes, I think what we found is, of course, the large Orlando has a regular established committee. There are smaller facilities that do. What we found in our comments, Jerry, that I think is important, COVID has created greater awareness for the importance of the dialogue, the ethics processes, decision-making, that all of a sudden questions arose, urgency created. And a lot of comments that we received was about its urgency and importance. But I think my colleagues who also spend time with the larger committees would say that there's room for growth. Assessment of committees, for example, are not done as regularly as perhaps they should happen to help better, to become better, more effective in how ethics committees are run and executed. Is Dr. De Leon with us today? He was going to join us, not sure. I think I saw Dr. Lampkin. Are you there, Andy?
I am here. Let me show myself. Yes, I thought I saw Dr. De Leon earlier.
So I think this question about professional ethicists on availability, notice that in our survey, there were few that were actually available. And I think this is one of the things that the consortium, Jerry, to your leadership, thanks to your leadership, I think there's opportunities for us to create awareness, make available. Are there talent, people, availability to spread the professionalized, trained, well-trained ethicists to be made available across systems? I think become important.
This might be a good time just to mention a couple of resources that are available. I encourage all of you who care to develop your own password protected account at adventistbioethics.org. And you'll see there that you have the opportunity to ask for an ethics consultation that we will send to one of the members of a team of clinical ethicists, all of them uncommonly well experienced in the field as experts, and try to get a rapid turnaround on difficult cases. We haven't had many takers for that, and I would consider that a good sign. I think it's best if you can solve these problems at home without additional help, but help is there in case people need it. A couple of other things I'd mention very quickly. There is a course developed by Dr. Robert Orr, one of the nation's leaders, a course for hospital ethics committee members. I know that Chaplain Silva, who was here earlier, I don't know if he is right now, had his committee go through the course. I actually got to speak for their commencement address. They graduated from the course. So that course is available at no additional cost to those of you who participate in the consortium. And then it's obvious, Edwin, from the results you got back, we still have quite a bit of PR work to do when it comes to sharing the resources that are available on the consortium. One of the most valuable ones, I'll stop with this because I could go on and on, but I'll stop with this. You can find probably 50 or 60 policies, hospital policies that relate to many different aspects of clinical ethics. And I think that that's a fairly valuable resource. If you're developing a hospital policy, you might want to look there and see what's already been developed by others. You may find some use there.
No, thank you, Gary.
Enough for me on that.
No, I think the consortium, I think the finding is that there's little awareness. It's an opportunity really for us to advance. Danny, thank you for your question around community member employee. You know, I'll let others that are more, have more experience with ethics committees to respond, but our survey did identify that there are community members, clergy from the community that join, and even ethicists from the local communities sometimes are invited. The actual ratio differs. Perhaps others could chime in on this particular question about ratios of who should be a member.
Edwin, hi. Thank you for presentation and for this survey. Maybe I'll just try to clarify something because I wasn't clear. Maybe I missed first few minutes when we were struggling to get in and start. You know, we talk about ethics committees, and so that's one element. And then we talk about ethics clinical consultations, which is sometimes done by committees in certain institutions or by individual ethics clinicians or clergy or chaplains or whatever. So when you were doing the survey, it is the ethics committee itself, and the purpose of that committee would be what? To lead the institution, the hospital in decision making on particular cases, or just guiding them through the larger process of moving in policy making and whatnot. I'm trying to ascertain whether the clinical committee, we at Loma Linda have both ethics committee, but also we have clinical ethics consultations, which is not one and the same, although there are relationships to each other.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for, so our focus was on committees, and their roles, their function, their leadership, their structure, their needs, how often they meet, just to understand the bioethics structure. Now, we did find that within bioethics committees, they also participate in consultations as part of their function. But you're right that consultations happen also independent of a committee. But we didn't get into those aspects, but just focused on ethics committees itself. Yeah.
There's another question from Chad about, I think you mentioned briefly, is were other religions or faith either joining these discussions or members of the committee?
Yeah, thank you. We did not ask about other faith traditions and in the membership. If we did get information about other clergy, but we don't differentiate whether those clergy in the background of the clergy or religious leader. Unfortunately, we did not. But they are invited. Other members of the community clergy are invited. We have data on that, but we don't know the details of those individuals. I hope that helps to answer that question. Dr. Butler, Russ Butler, I'm noticing, Dr. Smith, about the population health. We actually asked about that, and Dr. Lampkin, you may want to respond or reflect on that. There is increasing issues around issues of equity. Dr. Lampkin, you want to chime in on the question around population health inequities issues?
Sure. On the main campus, we call it the main campus, AdventHealth South, the largest campus in Orlando. Dr. DeLeon, myself, and many others that are actually on this line. We serve on the ethics committee there, and very often questions are raised along the lines of population health issues of health disparities and the like. As you can imagine, when COVID hit and there was talk about the vaccine and the availability of vaccine, who should have access to the vaccine, there was a lot of discussion along those lines. So those discussions are ongoing, but the committee is that particular committee is very concerned with those kinds of issues. And we made it a part of our educational focus. Every so often we rehearse or review the major themes in biomedical ethics, and justice, as you all know, is one of those themes. And those kinds of considerations find their way into the discussion when we talk about justice.
Following on the chat, we have a few more minutes for questions. There's a question on mentioning that multi-faith ethics committees do exist, and some of our colleagues are members of those. I'm curious if we have in this area a regional bioethics consortium, and it came together during the COVID crisis to talk about resource allocation, and policies were developed and plans were made. And I'm just interested, and we probably don't have enough time to explore, but if others have similar experiences and what has been some of the results of that. So that's my question. One of our other colleagues is curious about ways of promoting careers in bioethics, and I'll turn that back to Jerry at the appropriate time, because he'll get you in as a fellow and all those good things. So yeah. But anybody else got regional bioethics groups that cross districts or anything?
This is Frances from AdventHealth Orlando. During the COVID crisis, Dr. DeLeon led out in a meeting where we were looking into the allocation of resources. And we actually mirrored in the state of Florida, we have a bioethics network for all the various hospitals in the state of Florida who had developed a position statement. We actually reviewed that. Hamilton was involved, and we had memberships from all the various hospitals in the South and North divisions of AdventHealth, Central Florida divisions. And we were looking and reviewing that and developing, statements regarding if we needed to get to the point that we had to allocate care for our COVID patients. So, and that was very rich to have all the different members from the various areas to be involved.
Excellent.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you for your leadership, Frances. It's really important and meaningful.
Any final questions for Ed?
So colleagues that are part of the consortium in this conference, what I think our work demonstrates is bioethics conversations, committees, consultations is part of a core to our mission. It highlights the importance of educating, training. One of the greatest contributions is the consortium, the resources available. I think there's opportunities to grow, expand. That overview that you mentioned, Jerry, by Dr. Orr, that orientation, it should be made available. I mean, we found out that there is hardly any introductory training for members of committees. So thank you for anticipating that. Anyway, thank you, colleagues. We will be, the team is putting together this report. There's more information to share. We'll reach out to a few of you to give us further insights because, again, we think this is important for the role of the mission of our Adventist healthcare systems across the country and beyond. So thank you. And my apologies for the technical difficulties today.
No, well, thank you, Edwin. And it's the top of the hour, Jerry, and I'll turn this back to you for summary.
Thank you, Bob, for convening, and thank you, Edwin, for sharing. We overcame all the technical difficulties and we got through all your slides. I think the main question I have in my own mind is whether there would be use in having a collaborative approach to a survey of this sort for all of our systems so that we could share data across the systems I think we might learn a lot from that. So we'll probably take that up with the Executive Council for the Consortium. Edwin's a member, Bob Smith's a member, and that might be a good thing for us to discuss at an upcoming meeting. I think that the main thing to say right now, in addition to thanks to Dr. Hernandez for sharing the time, is that we are focused on coming to your place next year, Dr. Hernandez, and the campus that we see over your shoulder. We intend to inhabit for a couple of days, and right now we're focused on May 2. I think it's May 2 and 3. We'll firm that up tomorrow.
Yes, correct.
Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for your time here today. I hope all of you can return tomorrow for the third of these sessions. Dr. Carla Park will again be presenting our devotional, and then we have a couple of excellent panel discussions coming up with representatives from the various systems and also from the church. So we're going to sign off now, but if you have any questions that you need answered before, or if you want the link shared with anyone, just let us know. You can email me if you choose to. It's G as in Gerald Winslow at llu.edu. That's Loma Linda University. All right, we'll see you tomorrow. I hope you can join us again.